Is there really a normal-looking guy on CNBC right now discussing AI doom via instrumental convergence? You wrote on behalf of BCA Research, we think there is a more than 50-50 chance AI will wipe out all of humanity by the middle of the century.
Yeah, I think the reality is that if you give a AI a goal, the AI will want to increase its power, its resources.
When you look at other economists, do you think they're totally crazy?
I think people have a lot of trouble thinking exponentially.
Welcome to Doom Debates. Dr. Peter Berezin has been a professional macroeconomist for over 25 years. He was born in Russia, moved to Canada at age 7, where he still lives. He got a master's in science from the London School of Economics, a PhD in economics from the University of Toronto, and he has a deep background in applied math. Just going over his bio a little bit, 2000 to 2007, he worked at the International Monetary Fund, an international organization based in Washington, D.C., which provides economic advice and financing to countries experiencing financial crises. He was in the Asia department and later the research department. Then 2007 to 2010, he worked at Goldman Sachs. He was a senior global economist on the global macro team, wrote research on the global economy, helped Goldman clients understand the world and structure their investment to reduce risk. 2010 to present, he's been a research director at BCA Research, which is the world's largest independent provider of macroeconomic research to the investment community. Peter is a well-known name among professional investors who read macroeconomic research. Peter, welcome to Doom Debates.
It's great to be on.
Let's dive into your positions on macroeconomics and what kind of guidance you're giving to the readers of BCA Research. And then we'll zoom out and we'll talk about cosmology and AI doom and what's going on with our probability of survival.
Right now, I'm known as a doomer with respect to my view on recession risk and the prospect of lower stock prices. And it's funny. I like to be out of consensus. And going into this year, was I ever out of consensus? Bloomberg has this survey where they ask various strategists, there are about 25 of us or so, where they expect the S&P 500 to be at the end of the year. My target was 1,500 points lower than the next person over. So I've been expecting a recession for the last 6 months or so. I've been expecting this trade war to intensify, and I've been expecting stocks to fall. And as we speak today, they're declining.
Yeah, I want to go over your recent track record because as far as I can tell, it's actually very impressive. So in 2022 to 2023, you were predicting that the U.S. would actually avoid a recession and that inflation would come down without much of an increase in unemployment. So it seems like you were actually contrarian right about 2022, 2023, right?
Yeah, back then, I was the optimist in the room arguing that inflation would come down with very little cost to growth. But then last year, as others were getting more optimistic, I turned more pessimistic because it seemed to me that a lot of the insulation around the economy had disappeared. So in 2022 there were millions of excess job openings. Anyone who lost a job back then could walk across the street and find new work. That wasn't true anymore. By late last year, those $2 trillion plus in pandemic savings that people accumulated, they had spent those. So the economy was more vulnerable, and I expected the trade war to be worse than people were thinking, and that sort of turned out to be the case. So usually when you have an economy that is vulnerable and gets hit by shock, what you end up with is a recession.
Yeah, makes sense. And you called that out basically in 2024. Last year, you started becoming more pessimistic. And you told me this right before this call. The timing's interesting because the last few days, I think we've seen all the indexes go down 10%, right? And you told me you were bearish before the call. So I think that's a little base point for you as well.
Yeah, that's right. It's been a busy past few days. Mm-hmm.
All right. And your position on AI risk kind of relates to finance because I've seen you say that AI is going to be very good in the short term, but then in the long term, it's very risky.
Yeah, AI is creating all sorts of opportunities, all sorts of profits for companies like NVIDIA. But the risk is that it leads perhaps to a number of unforeseen circumstances. So I want to be clear, there is a real upside to AI. AI if it ends up transforming itself into like AGI, that could be the equivalent of the agricultural revolution, of the industrial revolution. Like both those revolutions saw a 50-fold increase in growth, right? So you're talking about global growth now, which is around 2% or so, going up to 100%, GDP doubling every year. That potential is there from
Yeah.
AGI, but the downside risk is also there. And that downside risks stems from the difficulty I suspect we'll have in harnessing AI in a way that is safe and doesn't lead to all sorts of unfortunate outcomes.
Mhm. Okay, well, I'm curious. It seems like you're at the top of your field of macroeconomics and predicting where the economy is going to go. But there's also the efficient market hypothesis and the best practice of like just buying index funds. So what I'm wondering is, would you say that you've beaten the market?
Well, personally, I have, yes, by a fairly large margin. And I think the way you beat the market in general is by adopting a contrarian stance. There's a lot of kind of herd behavior, especially when it comes to investing. People just kind of go with the flow. And if you can kind of think independently, if you're willing to say, wait a second, everyone is wrong, I'm right, it's hard to do. But if you can do it, then you can certainly outperform the market. That's been my experience at
Uh-huh.
least.
Okay, well, I must be doing something wrong because I'm definitely a contrarian, but I haven't beaten the market. I actually have a situation on my hands that maybe you can help me with here. So in December of last year, I was really bullish on Nvidia. I saw there was a dip in the price. I thought everybody's going to need GPUs. So I bought a bunch of Nvidia calls. I bought some Nvidia stock on margin. I went long. I mean, I didn't put my life savings into it, but I took a significant long position. And I even mentioned on the show that I think Nvidia stock is a good buy for people who want a nice return. And now Nvidia's down like 30% since I did that. So what's going to happen with Nvidia, and what should I do differently next time?
Well, I think the issue here is that there could be competition. So if you think about, the dot-com period, what was the company that was making the picks and shovel for the internet? It was Cisco, right? Cisco at one point was the world's most valuable company. Its stock price still hasn't gone back to where it was
Right.
25 years ago. Why? Because a lot of competition came in and Cisco couldn't keep up. I think that's the risk with NVIDIA. Not that its technology won't work, but others will come in and undercut those 70% margins that NVIDIA currently enjoys.
hmm on this topic of whether you've beaten the market, it seems like there's no doubt that you've published research that was contrarian and on point, at least in the last few years. But you don't really run your own fund, right? So do you really have like that hard data saying that you've like compounded over more than a decade and beat the market in that sense?
Yeah, it's funny. I don't think I mentioned this to you before, but way back when I used to write a blog, people can still find it. Just Google stock coach at blogspot.com. I think it's still there.
Great. I'll stick
I,
it
ha-
in the
I
show
haven't
notes.
updated it since like 2007. But what I did back then, and I published all of my results, and they haven't really deteriorated much since I stopped writing that blog. I concentrated on small cap stocks, micro cap stocks, in fact, because that's where I found the biggest mispricings to be. With large caps, it's harder because large caps are covered by dozens of analysts who know more about these companies that you could ever hope to know. But with small caps, you often can find real gems if you know what you're looking for. If you look for companies with clean balance sheets, decent profitability, a lot of insider buying. So there are ways to do it. It's not easy. It's not easy. But I certainly don't believe that it's impossible to beat the market on a consistent basis.
hmm Okay. Let's put aside how badly I've done recently and just in general right now, how are you recommending that investors position themselves? Should we just move to cash?
Yeah, I think so. I don't think the market has priced in a recession yet. That's coming. That shoe will drop. So you want to own more cash. I think you want to own more bonds. Bond yields are coming down.
Right.
Will
I mean,
probably.
would you literally say cash, or do you just mean bonds?
Well, I think a mix of cash and
Okay.
bonds. If you're going to own stocks, own more consumer staples, healthcare, these sort of defensive sectors. And then if you want to be a little bit more coy, there are other hedges out there. You could buy puts, you can buy volatility. You could buy the yen, for example. That's my favorite currency for the rest of the year. But in general,
Yeah.
I think you want to be defensively positioned right now.
What about just sitting in like, the Vanguard Total World, get a stock fund, get a bond fund, and then it's like, well, maybe the US is going to do a recession, but is it okay to just own the world as a whole and be long?
I think that's perfectly fine. Like if you don't want to devote a lot of time to studying the economy, studying financial markets, and I think that applies to like 98% of people. I mean, I do this because it's my job. If this were my job, I wouldn't be doing it. So if you don't have the time to devote to financial markets, just buy a broad-based ETF and get on with your life. I think that's perfectly
Mhm.
reasonable.
So I did, I guess, do one thing right, which is 4 years ago, I did put a lot of my savings in just this diversified index fund, stocks and bonds. I use Wealthfront, so I got like a diversified allocation. And I did put a good chunk in, Europe, emerging markets, whatever. I did the whole allocation, right?
Mhm.
And
Okay.
for the last 4 years of like, well, I'm losing here. Like the U.S. is on a bull run, like that's where all the growth is. But I'm like, whatever. I just want some dampening in case something happens to the U.S. And this is like the first time where it's like, okay, nice. Now my losses are dampened a bit, right? It's the first time it's actually working.
Yeah, I mean, uh, as they say, stocks take the stairs on the way up and the elevator on the way down.
Yeah,
And everybody, it's like the old Mike Tyson line. Everyone has a plan until they're punched in the face. Everyone thought they're
totally,
going to
totally,
time the
totally.
market, get out before it falls. How many
Hmm.
people did that? Most people claim that they did, but we all know that
Right.
never happened.
Yeah, no, when you say, talking about like taking the elevator on the way down, the perspective that I have when I look at this stuff is like, oh, okay, it sucks that things are down 10%, right? It sucks that my portfolio is taking a hit. But like at the end of the day, even the fluctuations we're seeing now are relatively small fluctuations on the surface, right? We haven't seen like a 50% drop yet, right? We've still seen, okay, maybe 10%, maybe 20% if you compare to the peak of like the NASDAQ. But like the real stock market drops from my perspective are going to happen when like North Korea nukes us. Like that's when the real fall is going to happen.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So there are these kind of tail risks out there that, quite frankly, people don't want to think about, but they're there. What are the
Hmm.
chances of a war between China and Taiwan? I don't know, but it's not
Right. Like
zero,
like
right?
I always come back to this. Like the world doesn't owe you 7% a year. It doesn't even owe you a lack of a huge decline. Like the fact that we even have the economy still chugging along is already like a very blessed outcome.
Americans are very, very lucky. I mean, it's kind of bizarre to hear Donald Trump talk about how the world is ripping everyone off, ripping the U.S. off. Americans are by far, at least amongst the very large economies, the richest people in the world. America has the dollar, which is the global reserve currency. You could have been in Argentina. Argentina was
Right.
the third wealthiest economy at the start of the 20th century, and now look where it is. I mean, it's starting to improve now under new leadership. But if you invested in Argentine stocks, you're basically zeroed out. True for German
Right. Right. Right.
stocks
Right.
in the
Right.
1930s, true for Russian stocks several times, including not so long ago. So, yeah, things could be a lot worse.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And there's always those doom predictions in the US of like, yes, the stock market has been extremely consistent. If you take any multi-decade perspective, it's just been amazing. It's been a money machine, but that may stop, right? That's definitely something we got to keep in mind.
That's right. That's right. There's a bit of a survivorship bias here, right? Like, why is the U.S. Stock market 70% of global stock market wealth? Because the U.S. has done exceedingly well, and that's not guaranteed to occur going forward.
Right. Now, everything I've said so far is still considered like normie macroeconomics. We haven't even injected artificial superintelligence into the discussion yet. But it is interesting that among economists, you're kind of an economic doomer because of everything you said so far. And in economics, they don't call it a doomer; they call it a bear, right?
That's right. Although as you mentioned earlier, I'm not a perma bear. Like a perma bear is someone who's like always bearish, just never changes their view. I shift. And back in 2022, back in 2023, I was an optimist. People even accused me of being naive back then for not expecting worse economic outcomes. So I'll change my view as the evidence changes. I don't need to listen to others to tell me what my view ought to be. I just set my own view based on my own analysis.
Mhm. When I asked you how to position right now, you mentioned getting into cash, bonds, maybe buying some puts if we're adventurous. I also want to connect that you currently have the lowest S&P target right now, right? For context, last time I checked, I think it's already gone lower, but when we last talked, it was at $5,600, the S&P index, and a lot of economists are predicting a rebound by the end of this year. A lot of economists are saying, hey, you're going to get 10 to 15% growth. And you were saying, this is like a week ago when we talked, you were saying, no, it's going down 20%. I was going to ask you that prediction, but even in the week that's passed, it looks like we're already halfway to your prediction, right?
We are like it's quite funny. Like going into this year, if you look at all the strategist forecasts, they're all like lumped around like 6,500 to 6,800 on the S&P 500. Like there was no one other than me that was predicting for stocks to fall, which is kind of weird, right? Because
Yeah.
stocks were very expensive going into this year. In fact, as expensive as they were anytime since the dot-com bubble. So just based on valuations, I think you should have been somewhat concerned. And then you also had kind of this wild card around Donald Trump, who for decades talked about how he wanted to increase tariffs and that he didn't really get a chance to do it in his first term because of COVID. Like he was telling you all this, and people just didn't want to listen.
Hmm. So when we talked a week ago, it was at 5,600, the S&P index. You were predicting all the way down to 4,500 by the end of the year. Today, it's at 5,100. So we're literally halfway down to where you wanted to go. So is your target still 4,500 for the end of the year?
Yeah, I mean, not much has changed relative
Okay.
to my expectations.
Wow. All right. Well, that was a nice, quick validation. Before we talk, that's always nice. Now, okay, so we talked about economic doom in terms of being bearish where the S&P is going to go. There's another form of doom, as famously stated by Senator Richard Blumenthal in his conversation with Sam Altman. Here, I think we have a clip of that.
You have said, in fact, and I'm going to quote, development of superhuman machine intelligence is probably the greatest threat to the continued existence of humanity, end quote. You may have had in mind the effect on jobs, which is really my biggest nightmare in the long term.
What is the probability of this kind of unemployment doom, most people's doom, which is job loss? What percent unemployment would you predict by 2030?
I'm not super worried about AI leading to mass unemployment because ultimately, if AI does displace a lot of workers, what that's going to do is make people more productive because they'll be able to use AI in their roles. More productivity means more wealth. And so it's a question of how you spread out that wealth. If unemployment does rise, like what's going to happen? Well, most likely the Fed will cut rates. Most likely there'll be fiscal stimulus, which is a lot easier to do if unemployment is high and interest rates are low. People say, well, what happens if AI can do like everything that people currently do? There's sort of an analogy in economics. People talk about absolute and comparative advantage. And the idea there, and this is something first formulated by David Ricardo many, many years ago, was that even if a country does everything better than another country, they can still trade. Because what they'll do is specialize in those things that they do best. They're going to specialize in those things where they have a comparative advantage. I feel it's the same with AI. Humans will find a niche. AI will find a niche. If we protect ourselves and don't let AI destroy us, I'm not too worried about mass unemployment. So there, I'm not a doomer.
Let's talk about Ricardo's law of comparative advantage, because it is true that, just to summarize for the viewers, so the idea is like, let's say here in the United States, let's say we're more efficient at farming and also manufacturing, right? Two different categories. And then there's like this barely developed country, Malawi, let's say, right? And they're like worse at both. But if our relative efficiency is even higher at manufacturing, then we should let them do the farming and just buy their products, even though we could also farm better, right? So that's like a rough summary of
That's
Ricardo's law,
precisely
right?
correct. Yeah, exactly. That's precisely right.
Right. But doesn't that break down with superintelligence AI somehow? Like in this particular scenario, wouldn't the scenario just be that we don't need the actual humans of Malawi because we can just have the superintelligent AI go take over the island or do its own farm? Like somehow I'm pretty sure it just breaks down.
Well, I mean, if we are able to harness AI, the world is going to be a lot more productive. There's going to be a lot more output. There's going to be a lot more wealth. And so it then becomes a question of how you distribute that wealth. Now, of course, some people will lose their jobs and some people will suffer. The people talk about the Luddites. Oh, you're a Luddite. You don't care about technology. But the Luddites actually had a point. They were displaced by automated weaving, and most of them didn't. Uh, uh, weren't able to continue working and earning uh, gainful pay. So there are going to be problems, but I think if we manage those problems, redistribute the wealth as necessary, then it's not going to be horrible. The risk to me is that AI itself gets out of control or people use AI for all sorts of nefarious purposes. It's not so much around the economics.
Right. I just want to kind of put a bounding box around Ricardo's law of comparative advantage, which is like, it doesn't seem like that much of a defense against AI. It seems like the defense holds up if AI just makes us 50% more productive at everything and it just supercharges the economy. But do you agree that there's some threshold where it just becomes so easy and cheap on an absolute level to have the AI do stuff for us, where I guess the issue is just that the friction of trading, right? And the absolute cost of the goods of shipping them in from Malawi or whatever, right? The non-AI economy, doesn't it just stop protecting the humans? Doesn't Ricardo's law just stop giving the humans jobs at some point?
Well, I think it depends on whether there are going to be areas where people still value human labor. Like if you're old age and you want someone to take care of you, would you be content with like a robot doing it, or would you like a human that can sort of
Yeah, that's fair, right? But
be
specifically the
empathetic?
Ricardo's law argument, right? Now you're using a different argument.
No, not really. I'm just saying that there are going to be areas where we have a comparative advantage by virtue of the fact that we're humans, and
Well,
those.
but actually that's an absolute advantage, right? If people prefer the humans, we're not talking comparative advantage, we're just talking advantage.
Sure, but even if there's a comparative advantage, it's still going to be perfectly fine. If a robot can, take care of an older person better than a human, but the human is still someone who prefers to work with another human, you're still going to get employment for that for that human.
Okay. Um, but yeah, but specifically, if we're just talking farming and manufacturing and the goods are fungible, then there's no reason to think that humans producing a good cheaply can just keep trading with us, right? Like you agree that at some point, maybe we just won't buy their stuff. Maybe we'll just take over their island, right? Like Ricardo's law is not going to protect an inefficient farming economy.
Well, it depends. Like, so if you have reasonably high levels of competition, and you roll out AI, and AI can do things so much more efficiently than people can. Like, what's going to happen to prices? Prices are going to fall. And if prices fall, real incomes, at least for those who are working, will rise. They can then spend more. I mean, that's been I've kind of looked back at history. That's really been the history of industrialization. Like, 100 years ago, most people worked on farms. Now only 2% of workers in the US work on farms. Like, what happens to everybody else? They move to other sectors of the economy, many of which didn't exist
Mhm.
100 years ago. I suspect something like that.
Yeah.
Uh,
Hmm. Okay. Yeah. And that's another question related to AI unemployment, which is a lot of people, most recently I saw Naval tweet this, but it's a popular sentiment, which is like, AI is not going to take away the jobs. It's going to, on net, create plenty of new jobs, and there'll be better jobs because there'll be jobs where you're empowered by the AI. You get to control the AI. So my question for you is, are you optimistic that there's going to be this new class of jobs that humans can take, or no?
so I think one thing I do worry about is the difficulty in controlling AI in a way that's consistent with our preferences. I think that's going to be very, very hard, which is why I do worry about some of these X risks around AI. If we manage those risks, I don't think it's going to be a big deal. I mean, a good analogy is with the automobile industry. At one point, before Henry Ford, all autos were kind of assembled by hand. It took a really long time. And then Henry Ford introduced the assembly line. And that meant that fewer people were required to put together an automobile. Now, did that lead to mass unemployment? No, because that reduced the price of autos. And all of a sudden, people who could never dream of being able to buy a car were able to do it. In fact, automobile employment rose. I suspect something like that will happen in the future if people can supplement their labor with AI and robotics and things like that.
Okay, yeah. So from the perspective of unemployment doom, it actually sounds like you're quite optimistic on that front.
Reasonably so, yeah, I would say.
Okay. Now, even though you're reasonably optimistic about maintaining a pretty low unemployment percentage, just hypothetically, if the AIs just keep taking more and more jobs and somehow they also don't kill us, they just keep taking our jobs, but they're still paying up to the human shareholders or whatever, is that scenario where we get all the way to 100% unemployment and humans just own capital or whatever, would you actually consider that a good problem to have?
I think it would be a good problem to have if AI generated a lot of wealth and people could spend more time doing things that they want to do rather than toiling away. Now, of course, for many people, including myself, and I'm sure yourself as well, work does give you meaning. You don't want to just have a life of leisure. And so the challenge, I think, will be to find vocations that you can do that gives you meaning that AI isn't going to take from you.
Now let's segue into talking about humanity's doom, the biggest doom of all, more than economic doom, more than unemployment doom. Let me give the viewers some context of how I found out about Peter for the first time. This was back in 2023. I randomly see a clip get shared on Twitter, and then I tweeted, "Is there really a normal looking guy on CNBC right now discussing AI doom via instrumental convergence?" And sure enough, you were actually discussing that. Let me play the clip now.
Is this basically saying AI wipes out humanity because the code writes code? Like, just what is the actual mechanism that you're concerned about?
What I'm concerned about is that all of the safety protocols that people have warned about are being completely blown through. So, for many years, AI safety experts have said, make AI, don't give AI the ability to use the internet. Don't give AI the ability to write its own code. What have we done that? We've gone right through that. And so the risk is that ChatGPT 6 won't be written by humans. It'll be written by ChatGPT 5.5, and so on and so forth. And it becomes an exponential growth in intelligence. And it's going to be unlike anything that we've ever seen before. Humans are used to being the top species on the planet, but we may not be if machine intelligence arrives. And it could arrive much more quickly than a lot of people are anticipating.
I feel like we're at the beginning of a disaster film where they show the news clips about
when everything went. The newscasters laughing it off.
There's The Last of Us, right? It started off with that roundtable discussion about how fungus is going to be the big thing.
But Peter, I got a question for you because, especially from Microsoft and Google, the two leaders here, and OpenAI, I guess, we hear the word responsible. We're going to do this responsibly. Seems like you're not buying that. What do you think?
Well, those companies are responsible to their shareholders. They're not necessarily responsible to humanity as a whole. And I think they have been rather complacent about some of these risks. And so I think those risks are there. And again, it doesn't have to be a Terminator type of scenario. Like if you have an advanced enough AI and you say, okay, we've got this problem, global warming, come up and implement a solution that alleviates global warming. If you don't say anything more than that, it's quite possible that the AI will say, okay, well, nuclear war would reduce the temperature of the planet. So the problem, and we've seen this over and over again with complicated systems, is that they can be very, very unpredictable. You give them a set of goals, and then they have to adopt certain sub-goals to achieve those end goals. And those sub-goals could be not the sort of thing that we want them to do.
This was when Eliezer Yudkowsky was doing a bunch of interviews, and he had his trademark fedora That was like his look for a couple years. So at the end of your clip, I gave you an honorary fedora.
I appreciate that.
What kind of stuff were you reading that led up to that interview?
I've been interested in kind of existential risk well before AI became as topical as it is now. Probably my introduction came in reading some of the work that Nick Bostrom has written, and in particular, building on the work that John Leslie and Brandon Carter have done around the Doomsday argument. That argument to me was always actually fairly compelling. Like, what are the chances that we just happen to be living at the dawn of AI? Why are we living like 10,000 years in the future? It's still going to be around. It's still going to be people around then if AI doesn't kill us all. Oh, wait a second.
Question.
Maybe AI will kill us all. And that's why we're having this conversation now rather than 10,000 years from now. It sounds like a kind of a hokey argument, but it's actually very difficult to...
Yeah, I'm familiar with this. This is actually called the Doomsday argument, what you're saying right now.
Correct. So Bostrom has kind of this nice analogy where he says, imagine two urns, and one urn has just 10 balls in it, numbered 1 to 10. The other urn has 10,000 balls, numbered 1 to 10,000. And you pull out a ball, and it's 7. All right. And you can say, well, what are the odds that I pulled this ball out of the smaller urn? Like, so, well, there's a ball with 7 in both urns, so maybe it's 50-50. Now, you could say that. You'd be wrong, because you can use Bayes' rule to calculate that almost certainly you pulled the ball out of the urn with the fewer number of balls. And the analogy is to your birth order. So roughly speaking, there's been about 100 billion people who have ever been born on Earth. So imagine kind of two scenarios. One, only about maybe 100 billion, 200 billion people will ever be born on Earth. And the other scenario is like 100 trillion people will be born. And all you know is that you're the 100 billionth person. Are you more likely to be in the scenario where not that many more people will be born, or one in which you just happen by sheer luck to be amongst the very, very first people to have been born? Well, again, you can use Bayes' rule, and you kind of end up with the conclusion that probably you're in that scenario where only a limited number of people will be born, and hence something bad must be lurking on the horizon.
Yeah, I actually agree with you that the Doomsday argument is pretty logically sound. I mean, I'm not super confident, right? So definitely we got to be humble that maybe we're missing something. But funny enough, the Doomsday argument is actually something people have been throwing around for a long time, even before AI Doom was on the table. And I personally first read the Doomsday argument randomly in high school when I was browsing Wikipedia, and Less Wrong hadn't even started yet. And I was just reading about it, and it's just the idea of like, look, if population is growing exponentially, if it keeps doubling and doubling and doubling, and here you are in one of the doublings, if there's really going to be like another 20 doublings after you, why would you be living in this like tiny fraction of early human history? That's not a very satisfying explanation of the evidence. You actually get a better, higher likelihood explanation of the evidence if you think that, okay, it's been doubling and doubling, and then it's about to crash. And so I'm actually living in the fat part of the curve. That's actually, all things being equal, that's actually a higher probability hypothesis, which then, like you said, which then makes you think like, oh, okay, well then I should update and think that a crash is pretty likely.
Yeah, I mean, of course, you have to be careful of these sort of arguments. So, for example, I'm 52. Okay, so I'm not going to say, well, I'm 52. I don't know how long I'll live. I'm just going to assume I'm somewhere in the middle of the distribution. So probably I'll live to like 104. Well, that's kind of a bad argument. Most likely, I'm not going to live. At least not in most branches of the wave function. Most likely, I'm not going to live to 104. But here, I know something about the average age of people. If I don't have any prior information on how long humanity is likely to survive, then making the assumption that you're somewhere in the middle of the distribution is a perfectly reasonable assumption to make.
All right, Peter. So now I got to ask you the most important question that everybody wants to know. Are you ready for this?
I'm ready.
P-Doom, what's your P-Doom, what's your P-Doom, what's your P-Doom?
Dr. Peter Berezin, what is your P-Doom?
I'm going to say like 75%, which is, by the way, exactly the same probability I attached to a recession in the US this year. I think it's high. I think it's quite high. But I would say one thing, that when you're talking about P-doom, you have to kind of consider the counterfactual. Like, what would happen if we don't develop AI? Because I think that humanity already is on a kind of a scary trajectory. If you look at birth rates, they've completely collapsed. Like, Korea's population is going to go from like 80 million to 10 million by the end of the century. China's going to lose like 700 million people. So we're already kind of in a fairly catastrophic situation. We know that IQs are starting to go down, not so much because of kind of the dysgenic arguments that people were making in the late 19th century, but rather because human intelligence was vastly increased by better health and nutrition. That seems to have sort of gone into reverse. So we've got this prospect that in 50 years, 100 years, there's going to be a lot fewer people. And those who are still around may not be quite as bright as their ancestors. And who's going to maintain all this technology? So I think we need AI at some level.
I had a previous guest, Rocco Miich, who was on the show a couple weeks ago. Did you see that episode?
I did, yeah.
So you're sounding a lot like Rocco, saying, look, we've got a major population crisis. We're heading toward doom. In Rocco's language, he said that P-doom is negative 60% because it takes our doom down from like close to 100% down to 40%. Now, in your case, you're still saying 75%. But do you empathize with Rocco saying like this is actually a negative doom if we build super intelligent AI?
I do. I think the counterfactual is not particularly blissful. I think that one way or another, we're going to have to augment our capabilities. And by the way, if AI really does transform itself into like AGI, we're going to have to make ourselves a lot smarter, because otherwise we'll be in a situation where it's like, talking to a cat and trying to explain to the cat multivariate calculus is just not going to work. AI is going to have all these ideas and we just won't be able to make heads and tails of them. So I think one way or another, we have to kind of move in that direction as a human race.
Okay. I want to push back on your alternative scenario of how doomed we are. But first, just going back to you saying what your absolute P-doom is, I want to give you some kudos for this, because I often criticize people who have a pretty high P-doom for kind of keeping it close to the chest and not shouting it from the rooftops, not explicitly helping move the Overton window, saying, hey guys, we all know we're likely very doomed as a species in our own lifetimes, right? You guys all know that, right? I often criticize people for not being straightforward with that. But in your case, you wrote a 2023 special report on behalf of BCA Research, Canada's largest investment research firm, and you wrote exact words, the safety risks around AI are huge, and we think there is a more than 50-50 chance AI will wipe out all of humanity by the middle of the century. That's what you wrote, right?
That's
okay,
right.
And you stand by that. You think it's more like 75%.
Well, I said over 50, so.
Okay.
I mean, 60, 70. Does it really matter when you get into these sort of numbers?
I agree with you that the number of significant figures you can give is not that high, but just saying over 50-50 or even 10 to 90, I think is a perfectly good answer, because it's very meaningful compared to saying, like, I don't know, it could be 0.1%, could be 99.9%. It's like, no, it's clearly 10 to 90. All right. So just to clarify then, would you sign the statement on AI risk, the famous Center for AI Safety statement that says mitigating the risk of extinction from AI should be a global priority alongside other societal scale risks such as pandemics and nuclear war?
I mean, I would sign that statement. I'm just very skeptical that we'll be able to really stop this freight train, because AI is not like nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons, there's only like downside. With AI, there's a lot of upside and there's a lot of profits to be made in AI. In the world in which we live, it's going to be very, very hard to meaningfully slow AI develop. And it's going to be difficult to really do much about some of these AI safety issues, even if we do slow down the pace of AI development. Because think about the automobile, right? It's like saying we're going to create all these safety mechanisms for cars before we ever build a car. Kind of hard to do, right? So I'm skeptical that we'll succeed. Certainly, I hope that we will, but I'm skeptical.
Okay, going back to the no ASI scenario, where we're just plodding along and AI is only roughly as good as it is today. In that scenario, let's say by 2100, do you really think P-doom is like 100%? Like, what do you think is P-doom without AI by 2100?
I don't think it's 100%, but I think it still is quite high. And one area, by the way, where I disagree with Rocco, was kind of this notion that artificial superintelligence will never really be much smarter than humans. He kind of made the comparison with chess, arguing that the best chess programs are only marginally better than the best chess players. It's a misplaced analogy, because why do we invent chess to begin with? Because we were able to play it. Like, we don't play like maybe Donald Trump plays four-dimensional chess, but we can't play that. So you can imagine all sorts of tasks that we just have no conception of how to do, and AI can do it. So I think AI does have huge possibilities in that respect.
No, for sure. But I'm just trying to clarify, if we don't get AI, hypothetically, is the human species going to wipe ourselves out before 2100, or like how doomed are we without AI?
I think there's a real chance we end up in some sort of a dark age without AI and without further human enhancement.
Yeah,
For the
but
reasons
how
that I-
bad is the situation? How bad is the P-doom in that scenario?
It depends on what you mean by doom. Like, if we're talking about kind of sinking into a dark age where a lot of people still survive, okay, that's not doom in the formal sense of the word, but it's still a really bad outcome.
What if I define it like this? What's your chance that the average quality of life between now and year 10,000 dips below the quality of life that we enjoy today, right? If you integrate the average across the next few millennia, we screwed it up. We didn't even get back to the peak of today. If you take, because we nuked ourselves and we lived like cavemen for a few millennia, so that would be like a doom scenario compared to like, oh, we kept civilization progress going. We kept adding little things to it. So it was better than today on average. So that's my question for you is, what is the P that we didn't even get to today's level for the next 10,000 years?
Probably, comparable to the P doom that I gave you for AI, around 75%. So it's kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. Like, if we don't move forward with this, we're going to have a lot of troubles. If we do, we're going to have potentially a lot of troubles too.
I find it kind of interesting that you see us, the trajectory has been so good for the last million years, right? Or 100,000 years, or if you want to measure since the Industrial Revolution. We've been on such a nice exponential, right? Like this is why I'm giving the accelerationist position, but
Yeah.
I personally am very much an accelerationist besides AI, because I'm looking at this curve and I'm like, hey, when we have capitalism, when we have technological progress, as long as there's no like doom tech, like a nuke or a super intelligent AI, this is like a very powerful engine and the trend looks very good. So why are you kind of dismissing that trend and being like, no, it's going to take a dive?
Gregory Clark, he's a economic historian, one of the more prominent economic historians these days. He wrote a really interesting book that I encourage your viewers to read, A Farewell to Alms. And he argued in that book that the reason the Industrial Revolution happened, the reason we have the prosperity that we have today, is because there was this selective pressure over a very long time for people who were more patient, more intelligent, more able to function within a capitalist society. Now, that selective pressure ended probably over 150 years ago, but then what took over was this Flynn effect, the fact that people were getting healthier, they had access to better nutrition, and so that actually resulted in bigger brains, smarter brains, more efficient brains. Now we're kind of going in the opposite direction. The slow process, like, it's not going to lead to doom in the next decade, but unfortunately, if you couple that with the collapse in birth rates, we're going to have a situation by the end of the century where we're going to really struggle just to maintain the existing technologies that we have, let alone build new ones.
Right. Okay. So you think the trend is going to reverse because the Flynn effect is going to, and this does seem a lot like what Rocco is saying, right? You're basically saying population decline and also the quality of the population will decline. Is this kind of like key to your argument?
Yeah, but I would put more emphasis on the Flynn effect rather
Yeah.
than sort of dysgenic fertility. That is a factor.
Yeah.
The reality is that IQ is 80% heritable by adulthood. In fact, it becomes more heritable over time, sort of the Wilson effect, as it's called. So there's definitely some of that going on, but the Flynn effect, I think, has had much
Okay.
bigger role.
So the interesting thing to me about the doom scenario that you and Rocco are painting is that it's quite easy to avoid. right? So like all you have to do is like notice that this is a major problem, and then governments can kick into gear. Like it's not that hard for the government to be like, hey, let's incentivize a program where we give you a huge tax rebate for having kids. Like you don't have to pay taxes for 20 years if you're raising a kid. And not only that, but we'll even, if they want to go China style, they can even be like, hey, we're gonna measure your IQ, and we're going to give you a bigger tax rebate if your IQ is higher, right? Because we want to make sure to fight the declining IQs. So, I mean, you're basically describing doom by like highly preventable cause, correct?
It's not highly preventable, unfortunately, because this has been tried. A lot of countries have spent a lot of money trying to increase fertility rates with very little effect, unfortunately. And by the way,
Sure.
right now, like it's not as though government balance sheets are in good shape. Debt is very, very high. They don't really have the ability to spend a lot more.
Well, let me ask you this though. You say lots of countries have tried it. Even just a straightforward deal like, hey, no taxes for 20 years when you have a kid. Has any country ever given a deal that sweet?
Perhaps not to that extent, but
But
the
that's a
empirical
positive sum
evidence,
deal, right? That's they should just do that.
they should have, there will be some effect on fertility from economic incentives, but the economic literature, I think, is just overwhelmingly clear that effect, sort of the bang for the buck, is very, very small. That it's really kind of culture that
Wait, but
determines.
they've never tried it. How could you have economic
Well, they
literature
have.
on
I
this
mean, look at
obvious?
like Korea, Singapore, across parts of Europe. They've tried to subsidize fertility, and the effect, at best,
Yeah.
is to uh, make people a little bit more likely to have kids earlier rather than later. But the total number of kids appear- doesn't seem to go up very much, even if you spend a
So,
lot of money.
but just to be clear, my understanding is we're talking about small subsidies here, right? So if you told me like, hey,
No, no, no,
you can
fair
have a
enough.
few $1,000s if you have a kid, like that's
Yeah,
different from
no,
being like,
if
we'll actually pay to raise the kid.
if you look at what like Singapore is spending, it's a lot of money, and they're still not able to bring their fertility rate anywhere close to replacement. It's like half of
Do you have
replacement.
a number on how much they're subsidized? Because that's my hypothesis right now is that I just think it's not being subsidized enough. Like, and we don't even have data on what happens when you subsidize it like you mean it.
I mean, I don't have the number on hand, but it's a fairly sizable number. And again, like some countries could do the sort of strategy that you're espousing, like eliminate all taxation for anyone that has like more than 3 kids. But most countries can't do that. Like the US couldn't do that. US debt is over 100% of GDP. That's true for France, it's true for Italy, it's true for Spain. But those Southern European countries have abysmally low fertility rate. It's not something that you can do fiscally,
Mhm.
even if you wanted to.
So I got to bring in a friend of the show, Robin Hanson, here because he's posted on a number of proposals for how to increase fertility, and he actually, like you and Rocco, sees it as a huge problem. Like he thinks the human race is pretty screwed, and we're on the path to lose our innovation because we're not going to have enough people to sustain innovation. So he's a bit of a population doomer as well. So he's on the same page, but he is optimistic that when you have a good enough proposal, you probably could boost fertility. And I think the kind of stuff I'm probably misrepresenting him here, but roughly it's something like, hey, what if you just gave the parents' tax obligation to the kid? Like some sort of transfer like that, where it's like, oh my God, you're making the kid an indentured servant. But like at the end of the day, that could actually be a positive some way to go.
Yeah, I think there's certainly scope for like innovative solutions where, in some sense, if you have a kid, then part of that child's income will be redistributed to you in your old age, whether they want that to occur or not. So I'm not saying that there's nothing that can be done. All I'm saying is that the literature suggests that the impact without any kind of change in culture is very, very difficult. Now, I have just one point, additional point on this. Over time, of course, there will be selective pressures for higher fertility because, like everything else, fertility decisions are partly heritable, and those people who want to have more kids will have kids who also want to have more kids. Yes, that's something that will happen over a very long stretch of time. But before we get there, we're probably going to have something that looks a lot like a population implosion.
Okay. So just to summarize, obviously there's a bit of a debate, and I am disagreeing because from my perspective, you're basically saying like, man, look at all these half-hearted efforts that governments have done to fight the population crisis. There's like such a high P doom. Let's go gamble on super intelligent AI, right? Like to me, that seems like kind of a crazy switch.
Well, again, I don't think it's binary, right? I think you can have a bit of both. But ultimately, if you're facing a labor shortage, one obvious solution is to augment the workforce with artificial intelligence, robots that have large language models or something equivalent in them. That's not a crazy solution as long as you can manage the potential risks around that solution.
Okay, so now there's one other element to this, to how we make decisions around this kind of thing, which is like, you're concerned about Doom in the next 100 years, maybe in the next 1,000 years, like kind of a slowish decline, right? The decline's not going to happen probably in our lifetimes, right? Probably our grandchildren will still get to experience some economic productivity in your mainline scenario. Is that fair to say that your Doom is like kind of slow?
Yes, maybe for society as a whole. But for me personally, right? Again, I'm in my 50s now. The likelihood that I'll live long enough to see the singularity, artificial superintelligence, if we put a lot of constraints on the development of that intelligence, is pretty low, right? So I do have a
Right.
personal incentive to see fast progress, even if it is at the detriment of society. Now, I'm not saying that's a good solution.
Yeah.
But
Okay,
I'm
and
just
that's a
saying that
different point, right? Is should we make our own lifetimes better with AI? Should we try to live forever? I think that's a separate point.
yeah,
I'm just trying to clarify that when I'm trying to clarify that my position isn't never build super intelligent AI. My position is we're building super intelligent AI way too fast, specifically way faster than we have any idea how to control it or steer it or give it the right preferences. And all we need to do is just hold off until we get better on that safety side and then maybe give it a shot. So people who are like, but the population is going to decline in 300 years. It's like, okay, can we just split the difference? Can we take an extra few decades to develop AI? Why do we have to Hail Mary develop super risky AI in the next 3 years when we can just take a little bit more time with it?
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I think we should put constraints on AI developments. Where I think maybe we differ is on the odds that these constraints will actually amount to very much. I think in practice, it's not going to stop AI from developing in a way that does potentially create some of these existential risks.
Okay, so it sounds like the crux between me and you doesn't really relate to like the 300-year doom scenario. So whether or not you and I agree on how doomed the population without AI is, like you think maybe they're doomed within 300 years, maybe I think we can have a good run for many thousands of years, it doesn't really matter because it sounds like we're really just both disagreeing on how valuable would it be to take a few extra decades right now, correct?
Listen, I'm all in favor of putting guardrails around AI development. I suspect that the AI train will still go over those guardrails, but we should put it in because not doing so kind of guarantees uh, a much higher risk of the worst case outcome.
I see. So when you take the Rocco position of being like, building AI is very risky, but it's actually negative risk when you consider doing without AI, if you're making that argument on a sufficiently long time scale, then I start to agree with you. Because if I'm just like, look, in 100 million years, we're doomed because we need to deflect an asteroid, right? That's like the timeline when we better nail asteroid deflection if we want to stay on Earth, right? So like, of course, and then of course you've got the heat death of the universe. So we better figure out like reversible computing to try to like extend ourselves like multiple quadrillion years. Otherwise we're doomed in like a trillion years, right? Like there's all kinds of doom. I like to joke that everybody's a doomer. The only question is timescale, right? So are you just a quadrillion year doomer or are you like a 20-year doomer? I'm more like a 20-year doomer. So I think you and I are just disagreeing on the timescale of doom. Is that fair to say?
I'm open to the possibility that AI could wipe us out in a fairly short horizon of a couple of decades. And I'm also in agreement that we should do what we can to avoid those risks. I'm just skeptical that we'll survive. And by the way, this is sort of where this whole multiverse uh, question comes in. I do think that there's kind of this selective pressure, this kind of selection bias, where we tend to see the best case outcomes. So even if 80% of timelines get wiped out, the ones that we'll experience are the ones where AI succeeds. Now, that might not be very comforting to you, but kind of it is to me, knowing that
Yeah.
regardless of what happens, it's still going to be around in some sense or another.
Right. You do talk a lot about this cosmology stuff and epistemology and how that relates to like anthropic principle and what that tells us about our likelihood to survive. And I want to dive into that soon. But first, I guess let me just put my cards on the table in terms of my policy recommendation. I'm not excited by my policy recommendation, but I just don't think that I have a better idea than this recommendation of look, governments have to be able to cooperate to pause when they judge that it's time to pause, to not build further superintelligent AI or to slow it down. So whether that time is today or whether they get spooked in 3 years or, 2027 is a new paper that came out that's very interesting saying hey guys, AI is going to become superhuman by 2027. So at some point, there's going to be a time, very likely, when we all realize uh-oh, we've gone too far. We've effed around. Now we're finding out, is there anything we can do whatsoever? And my policy position is we need to get ready today to have pause buttons, to be able to make the choice of hey guys, slow down, try to buy time. Basically enabling buying time is my current best policy position, which I think is also consistent with Eliezer Yudkowsky's institute, the Machine Intelligence Research Institute. I think that's their position as well. What do you think of taking that position, Peter?
I'm all in favor of those safeguards. My guess is that in practice, what's going to happen is that we'll get some kind of warning signs that we got problems. Most likely at some point, someone will develop using AI a virus that hacks into a bunch of bank accounts and release everyone of their savings, and people will be freaking out. Oh, wait a second, we need to regulate this better. That actually might be a good case scenario because then that will focus people's attention on the risks before those risks scale up to something that could wipe out all of humanity.
Right. I do think that a lot of people potentially even it's kind of the mainstream position to be look, I am scared of this stuff. I do think there's risks. I don't know how big the risks are, but I'm very open to seeing these warning shots, right? I'm very open to seeing signs that I'm ready to increase my fear level whenever I see more evidence. I think that's a common position. And so do you agree with me that because that's so many people's position, we should be laying the groundwork to take action when people reach their threshold, right? I'm talking about things building GPU hardware that has this centralized control, government consortium, remote pause capability, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Although I would say that in practice, it's going to be hard to do that without developing AI at the same time. Again, it's like designing airbags before you've even figured out that you're going to build a car. It's kind of hard to do. You need to sort of do it in tandem. And I suspect that will happen. Now, of course, the problem is that...
So by the way, it wouldn't be an airbag. It would just be a shutoff switch, right? I'm not even talking about the airbag.
Yeah, I mean, some sort of safety protocol that reduces those risks. Now, of course, the big difference between airbags and AI is that if the airbag doesn't go off or it's faulty, someone might die, but it's just one person. Whereas with AI, you do potentially have scope for large-scale doom.
Right, but I mean, it feels like you're pushing back on my proposal, but the airbag analogy isn't quite an accurate analogy to what I'm proposing. I'm just proposing let's try to get ready to coordinate to push the stop button if and when we feel like we need to push the stop button. Because how lame is it to, as a species, get into a position where we all agree, we have major mutual knowledge that we've gone way too far and we need to roll it back, and then we're totally powerless and then we're doomed. That, I feel like a lot of people would agree, yeah, that totally might happen. And that's why I'm saying today, okay, can't we do anything right now to at least build some brakes?
I think we need to do that. So I don't disagree with you at all. Whether our efforts are successful, I think that's an open question. But I agree, we need to spend some time on AI safety. Indeed, we need to prioritize AI safety. You're not going to get any pushback on that from me.
Yeah, so I find that interesting that when we have the first salvo of our discussion, kind of, if we only had 2 minutes to talk about it, maybe what the listeners would hear is me saying, I think P-Doom is high, you saying, I think P-Doom is high, but I think the P of not building AI is even higher, and they might just take that away.
Yeah.
But I feel like there's this very important second part to your position, which is hey, it's totally worth building a safeguard to pause AI. I feel like that's a very important piece of your position that you agree with me.
Absolutely. So I think that the counterfactual of not doing anything is not great for the reasons that we discussed, but going blindly into AI without any safety procedures, that's not a wise outcome either.
Okay, so at this point, it sounds like you and I are agreeing on a lot. And, obviously we have the disagreement where you're a little bit more pessimistic about the non-AI doom scenario. I think we can pull out of the population IQ tailspin. I'm more optimistic about that than you, but that seems like a relatively minor difference, especially since we're both concerned about like the 10-year time scale, right? You are concerned about a short-term time scale, right?
Sure, sure. And not so much like Terminator type scenarios. I'm just really
Yeah.
concerned that people will use AI for, building computer viruses, actual
Yeah.
viruses, that sort of thing.
Are you also concerned, like, what is your AGI timeline? Because consensus these days is 2031 or earlier. I think that's fair to say that's kind of like the expert consensus. Of course, there's like a bell curve around it. What is your timeline?
I think Ray Kurzweil said 2029 based on his sort of
Yeah,
exponential modeling. I think he said
right.
it, like decades ago. That
Yeah,
seems about right. I think it's probably going to happen. Maybe not by 2029,
right.
but let's say the 2030s.
Sure, sure. Or maybe 2029 plus or minus 5 years
Sure.
seems like a reasonable.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm on that page too, right? I don't claim to have more insight than that, but like the crazy thing is now very few people are now saying like 2050 or later, right? Like that is now becoming like a fringe view. Shout out to Robin Hanson. Like
Yeah.
he's still, in fact, like that's his view. But
Yeah.
Um, so okay, so you and I both agree that there's this like major intelligence explosion. Is that a fair term to use for you? That there may be an intelligence explosion coming in the next decade or so?
Yeah, absolutely. And the point that
Okay,
I would want to stress is that we should be part of that intelligence explosion, which means that we need
right,
to really think about how to use AI and other types of technologies to augment our capabilities.
right. So that is actually quite interesting. That at the end of the day, it doesn't seem like there's like a major near-term policy disagreement necessarily between me and you. Are you seeing any major
No, I
policy
don't think
disagreement?
so. I think I'm in the AI safety camp. I'm not, like I said,
Great.
my PDOM is very high, which means that I'm all in favor of measures that reduce it.
That's very very fascinating. It makes me think. If you think about economists as a class, your brethren. um, it's been observed, I think, by Tzvi Moshowitz. Do you know Tzvi? Do you read his stuff?
No, I'm not aware of him.
Yeah, Tzvi is amazing, by the way. If you guys are listening to Doom Debates, if you like my content, you gotta go check out. I'll put him in the show notes. I reference him every few episodes. He is like the authoritative journalistic voice, aggregating all the different smart takes on AI. So anyway, so Tzvi is saying he keeps remarking that economists as a whole are living in this world where like super intelligent AI just kind of never happens because they're always saying like, oh yeah, we're seeing maybe an extra percentage point growth because of AI. Like they're always making these like very modest predictions of how AI can transform the world. Where if you zoom out and you're like, wait a minute, the entire human brain has kicked off the human brain kicked off the Industrial Revolution. I don't see the other apes having anything like an industrial revolution. So this is like a qualitative difference in economic growth thanks to higher intelligence. And now we're going to have much higher intelligence than human. And you're telling me that's going to be like a 1% increase per year in GDP. So when you look at other economists, do you think that they're like totally crazy?
I think people have a lot of trouble thinking exponentially. So if you have an AI, let's say, give it some sort of IQ, the IQ is 20 and it goes to 40, 80. Well, 80 is still like below the average for humans, but now you're just a couple of doublings away for something truly unprecedented. And we saw that in different contexts. I remember I wrote a report just in the early weeks of the pandemic. I think the title was "Investors Are Too Complacent About the Coronavirus," sort of making that exponential argument that, listen, this thing is doubling. And yeah, it's doubling from a
Yeah.
very low base. But if it keeps doubling within days, we're going to have a big market panic. And that's exactly what happened.
hmm Let me just also make sure I ask you to get this explicitly. What do you think is the potential power of AI? Or in other words, how much headroom is there above human level intelligence capabilities? Do you think there's a lot of headroom?
Yeah, I think ultimately the headroom around what we can achieve is bounded by the laws of physics. And
Which are high.
which are very, very high. So, yeah, I think that once we get to something like artificial superintelligence, it'll just be able to progressively and very, very quickly expand on its own capabilities
Mhm.
and start to achieve things that we haven't even thought possible before.
Yeah, I agree. And what you and I are agreeing on right now is also what the major AI companies seem to agree on. Maybe not Meta, but like if you interview people from OpenAI, even the leadership at OpenAI, at Anthropic, I think at Google DeepMind, these major AI companies, they're actually on the same page as us of like, yep, we're building something with godlike powers. So that's fun that like, even though they're kind of the instigators, they're causing the problem that I see and that apparently you see because they don't have a pause button. Even though they're the instigators, they're on the same page as us of like, yep, godlike powers, that's what's on the table right now. But of course, your fellow macroeconomists disagree, correct?
Well, I think, again, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but most people, when they talk about the impact of AI on growth, are talking about, percentage point increase, something in that ballpark, which is what we saw from the internet, for example. So there's a template for that. But I think with AI, it's a different category class altogether.
Right. So actually, I maybe see a potential contradiction here then in your own projections, right? Because earlier on, when I asked you about like, what do you see as the economic trajectory? And you're like, oh, there's not going to be that much unemployment. I think that the jobs will get replaced, just like in other periods of like transitional, employment transition. And I don't really foresee like major economic doom. So how are you reconciling there being a ton of headroom above human intelligence, like godlike super intelligent AI, high P doom, and yet you're not saying like economic forecast going to zero, that's my forecast. Like, how do you reconcile those two?
It depends on who ends up with the wealth that AI produces. Now, if we truly produce AIs that are conscious, that are cognizant, that have their own goals and desires, then that's, of course, going to be very problematic for humanity, because now you've got a species, if you want to call it that, that is much superior to us. And of course, we know from our own experience that if you have a species that's more capable, the less capable species often ends up dying out. That, to me, is where the P-doom partly comes from.
Okay, I mean, but like even on the question of like unemployment, like maybe can I just dive in on that? Just like, what do you see a human doing if you just admitted that there's so much headroom above human intelligence and the AI might have an intelligence explosion and occupy that headroom? What do you see as a human job?
Well, I think, keep in mind that the vast majority of GDP in countries like the US stems from the services sector. It's not manufacturing, it's not the production of things. It's from services, it's from interacting with others. And I think there's always going to be a desire for people to interact with people like themselves rather than artificial intelligences. So that source of labor demand will persist.
This is what I call the Walmart greeter hypothesis, right? Like, well, I'll be useless, but at least we can stand there at Walmart and greet people.
I don't think so. I mean, most service jobs in the U.S. are actually pretty well paying, much better paying than even manufacturing jobs. So there will be things that we can do beyond
Right.
greeting people at Walmart.
But I feel like you may be conflating like the service industry with like things humans can do better than AI. Like the server, so like server, like literally a server at a restaurant. A lot of what the server does isn't like give me a friendly smile. It's just like carry the dishes, like bring out the check. You
Yeah,
know?
so maybe carrying out the dishes and washing the dishes will be done by robots, but the interaction with the server will require a human to be in the loop.
I mean, do you personally want to pay extra for a human to serve you if you have a really good robot serving you?
I wouldn't mind paying a bit extra to interact with another human being, and again, uh, if AI generates all
Okay,
of
have you
those.
ever? Oh, hold on. Let me just ask you though. Okay, let me test what you just said. When you go to McDonald's, have you ever, if you've ever used the kiosk when there's a human
Yeah,
waiting there? I feel
I
like
hate the kiosk.
you hate the kiosk.
McDonald's.
Okay, all right. So you're
Yeah, like
consistent. Okay, I like the kiosk.
no, when I go to the
Okay,
supermarket, I purposely avoid
okay,
the
okay. I'm a kiosk
like,
person.
I hate those.
Okay, fair enough. Fair. But it sounds like you're banking a lot on the essentialism of like, okay, you're interacting with a human, it's not an AI, but like, how close can it get? I mean, what if it was a robot that had like, a human mask that was very convincing? Like, how, you know what I'm saying? Like, how much of a soul do we need here?
Yeah, I think that's where the question becomes sort of existential. Like, if you have robots that, for all intents and purposes, are substitutable for humans, or at least we don't make much of a distinction between.
Right? And why wouldn't they be, according to your own future?
But then we've got a completely different society where it's not just humans and their technology being supplemented by AI, we've got humans living amongst robots, sort of like a Blade Runner type of scenario. That to me is a very risky scenario, right? If those robots have higher intelligence than us and have their own goals that are distinct from ours, that's going to cause a lot of problems. And that's where my high P doom comes from.
Okay, gotcha. All right, I want to get into your views on cosmology and the multiverse because you had this very whimsically titled report, Life, Death, and Finance in the Cosmic Multiverse, that BCA Research published in 2021. So this is actually pretty load-bearing in your views about doom and your views about economics. So just to recap, I know you've touched on this in the episode, but what do you think is like the most important implication that cosmology has to tell us about doom and finance?
Yeah, I think the most important implication is that there are potentially an infinite number of us. And so I think it's probably useful just to spend a couple of minutes sort of discussing what this multiverse idea is. The first thing
Yep.
to note that this concept of the multiverse, it's not a theory, it's the prediction of certain types of theories, such as quantum mechanics, such as inflationary cosmology. And so there are different levels, as Max Tegmark has argued, to the multiverse. The first level is simply a space that goes on forever and ever. And just like there's a finite number of ways that you can shuffle a deck of cards, there's a finite number of ways in which you can arrange matter, which means that if you go really, really far out, like a Googleplex meters out, you're going to eventually run into a universe that's exactly the same as our own, with exactly the same people. But of course,
Exactly. The way I think about it is like, there's so many different ways to arrange atoms. Like maybe there's 10 to the power of 100 ways to arrange atoms, which is a Google. And it's like, how are you ever going to get that same arrangement of atoms? Well, if you have a Googleplex, like if you have 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 100, if space is like that big and atoms are random, eventually you're actually going to get every configuration of a Google, right? So when you go hyper exponential, you can be surprised how many repetitive configurations there are. And also, by the way, I think we're both sourcing here from Max Tegmark's 2014 book, Our Mathematical Universe, right? We both think that's a really good book about multiverses.
It's an excellent book, and I encourage everyone to read it. And so you got kind of this just infinitely large space-time within a single universe. But then you also have inflationary cosmology, which tells us that there are many different universes, all of which, by the way, have an infinite amount of space in them. That sounds kind of weird. How can you have a bubble universe with an infinite amount of space? Well, what general relativity teaches us is that what we might perceive as space, others might perceive as time. So if you're looking at one of these bubble universes, what you'll see is this bubble that expands exponentially over time, but always appears finite. Whereas if you're within those bubbles, you have infinite space. It's a bit like, I encourage your viewers to Google M.C. Escher's Circle Limit Number 4. It's this beautiful piece of art that kind of models what these sort of cosmological bubbles would look like. So if you take, for example, the Earth, right? We've got the Mercator projection for the Earth. Everything that's in the Arctic and the subarctic looks a lot bigger. So Greenland looks really big. Antarctica looks really big. If you have negatively curved space, and this is what inflationary cosmology tells us, that the space itself is negatively curved within these bubbles, then you have kind of the opposite, where if you do a projection, the further you go towards the poles, the smaller everything is. And so you can actually have an infinite amount of things taking place within a finite amount of space. So you've got kind of that level of the multiverse. And then you've got kind of the one that stems from quantum mechanics, from the Everettian branching universe, where everything kind of that can happen does happen, simply because, as we kind of learn from quantum mechanics, if particles can be in more than one place at the same time, because we're made out of particles, then we can be in more than one place at the same time. Of course, the question is like, why don't we see our twins in these parallel universes? The answer is similar to what happens when you tune a radio. Like if you tune a radio, you're going to get a particular station, but you won't hear the other stations, even though they are broadcasting. It's exactly the same idea, the whole idea.
Right. But there is quantum interference. Like you can have a particle interact with its multiverse twin as long as you're controlling conditions really precisely, right? That's basically like quantum computing and stuff like that.
Yeah, and that's the challenge of quantum computing. How do you avoid that decoherence? It's very, very hard because when you have a macroscopic object that interacts with its environment, it's going to decohere. I mean, that's the whole idea of Schrödinger's cat. If you have a cat that's in a superposition of dead and alive, some of the light is bouncing off the dead cat, some is bouncing off the live cat. Instantly, these worlds decohere, and so you only see one or the other, not both.
Okay, so you and I think we're both on the same page as Max Tegmark that it seems like in some sense, in one or more senses, it seems like there is a multiverse, right? It seems like there's more than meets the eye to this like naive idea that like, yep, there's just like one path to the future and your consciousness is like doing a good job of recording it all on like a single memory tape. No, it seems like there's probably more than meets the eye, whether it's like somebody really, really far away in hyper exponential space or inflationary multiverse or ever ready in many worlds, to recap what you just said. But then my question for you is, okay, so what's the implication for like decision making?
The implication is that we need to distinguish between what we expect and what we remember. So let me give you kind of a analogy to think through that point. Imagine being part of this like crazy experiment where you're in a lab and the doctor puts you to sleep, and then the doctor draws a ball out of an urn. And in that urn, there's like 1,000 black balls and just one white ball. And the way the experiment is going to work is that the doctor will put you to sleep. He'll draw the ball. If it's a black ball, you'll wake up to the sound of like screaming and shrieking. And then the doctor will give you an amnesia drug, put you back to sleep, and repeat that experiment until you get a white ball. And once you get a white ball,
right,
no more amnesia drug, you go on with your day. And so going into that experiment, what do you expect? You expect your next moment in life to be one where the black ball is pulled and you hear all the shrieking. But after the experiment is over, because you got the amnesia drug every time the black ball was pulled, you only remember the white ball. You only remember waking up in a comforting environment. So I think what this means in practice is that there is kind of this selection bias taking place. We'll only experience those branches of the wave function or those parts of the multiverse where kind of things go right. To me, this is actually kind of comforting. It means that there's going to be some versions of me that survive. Those that don't, it's unfortunate. But I'm not going to be around to observe those versions. And so for me, that kind of does mean that there is this element of subjective immortality. It's subjective, right? It's not like every version of you will survive, but some will. And those are the ones that you'll experience. And I think that's kind of what's been happening over history. Like you yourself talk about all these near misses with nuclear weapons. Well, maybe they weren't really near misses. Maybe there were all sorts of branches of the wave function where nuclear war took place, and we're just not around anymore to have a conversation about it.
Right. I do often say on the show that when you look at humanity's chance of nuclear doom, there are a surprisingly large amount of people that look back on history and be like, well, as a species, we nailed it. We got mutually assured destruction. It's got a perfect track record. We've never nuked ourselves. So like, this is a solved problem. Like, good for us. Let's go hard on nuclear energy. Whereas I look back, I think this is actually the position that all of our leaders have ever had in government, which to their credit, like they all look back and they're like, oh, wow, we are really on the edge, constantly on the edge of nuking ourselves.
Yeah.
And you can see all these close calls, but for the grace of like 128-volt fail-safe switch, we almost dropped a 10 megaton nuke on ourselves. Like all of these crazy, crazy close calls are happening. And it's like, yes, we made it through. Why did we make it through? Does that mean that we're safe? Does it mean that we're always going to be safe? Are all the probabilities correlated? Or as you're bringing up now, maybe it just means that there's like many world twin versions of ourselves that got nuked and we're like the only survivors, right? That's one possibility.
Yeah, that's right. And so we shouldn't take a lot of comfort in the fact that there hasn't been a major nuclear war, because if you kind of believe in this multiverse concept, there's a selection bias towards only observing those situations where we survive. And so the true probability of nuclear war is probably higher than most people would think, based on the naive conclusion that we've avoided one for, 70 years. We shouldn't worry too much now.
I want to just let the audience know, I did a very elaborate episode that was all about why nuclear proliferation is super dangerous and we're absolutely not out of the woods, and it's actually the number one danger we face. I want to let you guys know that episode exists because it actually, for some reason, has way fewer views than all my other episodes. So I'm going to stick a link to the show notes. I actually highly recommend watching the episode where I talk about nuclear doom. But anyway, going back to this discussion, I think the nuclear example is actually great for me to poke at what you think about, like, all possible events actually do happen in the multiverse, because I think there's a distinction that I'm not sure you've been making, which is the distinction between epistemic uncertainty and like physical probability, or like, many worldiness. So in the case of nukes, if we look back at our history and we say we almost got nuked, maybe that just means the correct epistemic probability is that P of nuke per year is high, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the nukes actually had to have gone off. Like, if my epistemic probability of something is like 1% a year, that doesn't actually mean that in 1% of many worlds we get nuked. Like, there doesn't have to be a perfect correspondence like that. Do you see what I'm saying?
I mean, for me, it's very difficult to envision a universe where some things can happen and do happen, and other things can also happen but don't happen. Like, who decided what becomes reality or not? As Stephen Hawking said, who breathed fire in those equations to make certain things real and other things that could have been real not happening? It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And by the way, there's a very nice corollary between many worlds and this sort of idea of inflationary cosmology. It turns out, and there's actually a theorem that shows this to be the case, that the distribution of events within many worlds is exactly the same as in infinite space. So the fraction of you who's named Liron versus like George or Billy Bob, it's the same in many worlds as it is in an infinite space. And the idea actually has to do with this notion of the ADS-CFT correspondence, which basically says that a theory that describes what happens within the interior of a volume of space, a theory of space and time that describes what happens there, is mathematically equivalent to a quantum field theory that describes what happens on the boundary of that space. So you can think of many worlds as taking place in the boundary.
Right. Is holographic principle?
Yeah, that's right. And by the way, this is not like fringe science, like
no, for sure. Yeah.
ADS-CFT correspondence theory is by far the most cited theory in all of physics. And I think the next four papers are all kind of built on it.
Okay, let's do this example from your paper, the example where you talk about playing the lottery, buying a lottery ticket.
Right.
And let's say there's like a 1 in a million chance that the ticket pays out, whatever, the jackpot. In your paper, you were saying that you believe that even though you're probably going to lose, there's like 999,999 copies of you in the multiverse that lose, and there will be a copy of you that wins. Is that your position, that whenever you buy a lottery ticket, there's always a copy of you in the multiverse that wins?
Yeah, absolutely. And so you can argue to yourself, like, if that's the case, maybe I should buy that lottery ticket, because most versions of me will lose, but I can always take comfort in the fact that one version of me, or many versions of me at least, small fraction, but some fraction of me will win. That's sort of one way of thinking about risk. Another way of thinking about risk is when you're thinking about something bad rather than something that's good. So imagine that you're driving along and you come to an intersection, the light turns yellow, and you're like, I got to get to this meeting in time. Should you drive through it? Well, you can say, well, okay, I'm going to drive through it, and I drove through it, no problem, nothing happened. But if you're kind of this multiverse idea, then some versions of you didn't drive through that intersection. Some versions of you were involved in an accident. And if that's the case, maybe a priori, that should dissuade me from driving through that intersection. So I think there are consequences for how one lives one life if one takes kind of this idea of the multiverse seriously.
Okay, so going back to the lottery ticket example, if the winning lottery number is decided by a quantum lottery, like they have radioactive particles decaying and they measure how long the decay takes so that the distribution of outcomes is driven by actual quantum many world splitting, in that scenario, I think you're obviously correct that you get a version of yourself that has every possible lottery outcome in the actual multiverse. I'm with you there. But the lottery can actually be somewhat deterministic in a non-quantum way, right? So like, let's say they pick it out by like, having one of those like ball spinners, like at old folks' homes, like the bingo ball spinner. If that's how they do it, potentially that's like Newtonian enough or deterministic enough, and it's not based on quantum randomness. And so from my perspective, there actually is only one outcome in all the different quantum worlds. Like, or maybe there's not one outcome, right? Maybe there's a distribution, but I don't think that distribution is going to look like one wins and the other 999,000 lose. I think it's going to be a very different distribution. It sounds like you're being kind of naive about the multiverse probability.
Well, under Everettian many worlds, and by the way, the kind of the Everettian version of quantum mechanics is probably the most parsimonious, stripped down version. I mean, all it says is that the Schrödinger equation evolves deterministically. So there's actually no randomness in many worlds. What there are many worlds where different things happen. And so in the example that you gave where the ball is sort of chosen out of this machine, you don't know the air position of every air molecule in that machine. So stepping back, there's going to be some configurations of air molecules that generate a certain sequence of balls, and there's going to be other positions of air molecules within that machine that generate different sequence of balls. And so you've got this uncertainty about, it's called self-locating uncertainty, as it's called. One version of you will see the winning balls. You don't know which one a priori, which version of you that will be.
Right. So, I mean, I'm seeing two notions of probability that are both useful and true, and it sounds like you're kind of merging them into one notion, if I'm understanding correctly. The two notions that I see are, number one, there's the physical probability. For example, the percentage of the quantum multiverse that has a copy of you with a certain property. That would be like the physical probability, right? And you're basically saying, yeah, let's take that seriously, and I agree with you. But then there's also a different notion of probability, which is epistemic probability, which is like, hey, this is a fully deterministic Newtonian lottery. There's only one outcome in all the different many worlds, but I, as a Bayesian reasoner, I still give it a probability because that's how I maximize utility. Like that's how I navigate the world. I use Bayesian probability. But do you agree with me that there's two notions of probability here?
Not necessarily. So let me give you another analogy. Suppose, by the way, here's kind of a wild idea. Suppose there's some technology that allows you to be scanned, like all of you, like right down to every little bit of your brain. So you can actually create a digital version of Liron Shapira. Now you can put that digital version in binary form, right? And you can then take, say, the number square root of 2, and you will find at some point within the square root of 2, if you express it in binary form as well, there you are. There's Liron Shapira. But because this sequence of numbers goes on forever, you're going to show up over and over and over again. And we're kind of tempted to think, well, there's one version of me, the other versions are there, but they're not really me. But in fact, they're all kind of you. Like if you take the 11th version of you.
Yeah. No, okay. But what if I just simplify the question? What if I don't talk about the mathematical universe, or I don't talk about multiverses in general? If I narrow down the question to just talk about the quantum multiverse, do you agree that there's at least a distinction between quantum physical probability and epistemic probability?
No, I think, and again, for the reason I gave earlier, that the distribution of events is exactly the same in infinite space-time as it is in the quantum multiverse. It's just two sides of the same coin.
what if my 5-year-old is the one running the lottery, and he doesn't realize that he's like terrible at randomizing, right? So like he thinks he's like flipping a coin, but he always flips it the same way. Don't you think that his lottery can be sufficiently deterministic to a smart enough observer? And maybe he can convince another 5-year-old that what he's doing is random. But if I look at what he's doing, I'm like, oh, okay, this is clearly going to come up heads right now, right? Heads is going to be the winning lottery number in this example. So, but then Peter comes in and says, oh, there's two worlds, right? There's one quantum world where it comes up heads, one quantum. Well, no, you see what I'm saying? Like there's a difference here. Like not everything is a quantum probability.
Well, I mean, maybe. And I think there's an open question as to how you extract probabilities from kind of the ever-ready many worlds interpretation. I think there's a natural way of doing it. It's called the Born rule. But there's certainly some debate around that. But to me, it doesn't really matter whether you think of the ever-ready many worlds or you think about just infinite space. It's all the same logic.
Okay, well, I think we'll put a pin in that because I definitely think that I'm disagreeing with you here on how you're mapping everything to quantum many worlds. I think there's different notions of observing, but I think we've talked about that enough because I want to get to something else you're saying, which is like Tegmark World 4, right? That's also from Max Tegmark's really good book. I think we both believe that it makes a lot of sense, right? I think you probably even believe it more hardcore than I do, which is Max Tegmark's hypothesis here, the mathematical universe hypothesis, is just every mathematical structure that's like logically self-consistent, is also physically real in some broad sense, right? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, if say, a circle can exist in some sort of Platonic realm, kind of independent of space and time, which is kind of this notion of a circle or this notion of the number pi, whatever mathematical object you want to think of, if that can kind of exist in a Platonic realm, why not more complicated mathematical structures that might contain self-aware observers in them? And if we're living in such a structure, and by the way, like the universe does look very, very mathematical. There was a time many centuries ago where people just couldn't describe most things mathematically, but now we've got Newtonian explanations, which eventually became based on sort of Einstein's theory of relativity, which was supplanted by quantum mechanics. Now almost everything can be explained mathematically, maybe with the exception of consciousness. That kind of is a telltale sign that we are most likely living in a mathematical structure. And that has very important implications, because if you think about what sort of mathematical structure you're living in, well, if there's this ocean of mathematical structures, most likely you're living like in a really, really big one, right? Just because it's going to have more observers if it's really big. And so we shouldn't be surprised that there are all these levels of the multiverse. Everettian, inflationary cosmology. There's also issues around brains, membranes, all sorts of ways you can get multiverses. Of course, that's what you would expect if you're living in one of these fairly baroque mathematical structures.
Yeah. I love that observation. I saw it in your paper. You mentioned it now, which is just like, hey, it was counterintuitive for humans historically that everything would turn out to be math. Like even things that seem different. Like what makes a good musical composition, there's quite a lot of math turns out in there that'll tell you why. Or like, animals moving around, turns out there's not necessarily that much soul in them, and there's really quite a lot of like signal modulation to coordinate their muscles, and there's like math for that, right? So it's kind of funny that like everything is math, like compared to what human intuition says, that like some things, like animism, right? Like no, everything is a spirit. Nope, that's wrong. Everything is math except consciousness. Maybe it's the last holdout. I wish that I could go back in time and tell my nerdy, like 10-year-old self that everything is math and everything can be understood using logic, because at the time I was getting a lot of advice from people around me that not everything, right? Because I was like super nerdy. So a lot of people were telling me, hey, not everything is nerdy like this. There's like a whole emotional component too. And then I was like, oh crap, because I was, bad at that component. So I always just thought, well, I guess I'm just not going to understand half the world then. Whereas if I could go back and talk to my past self, I'm like, no, try harder on the nerdy side. You actually can start unpacking stuff just using your analytical mind.
Exactly. In many respects, math is one of the reasons, I've been doing math all my life. It's sort of a universal language for understanding the world. I mean, aliens aren't going to speak English, but they'll understand math.
Exactly. Okay. So then bringing it back to the multiverse, right? So I agree with your intuition and Tegmark's intuition. Like, I think it's a nice, elegant hypothesis to just be like, okay, every mathematical structure is real. Eliezer Yudkowsky has written a few posts about this kind of thing, and if to take some license paraphrasing him, it seems like his observation is like, okay, yeah, maybe everything is real, but it seems like some things are more real than others. Like there's this concept, he's used the term reality fluid, and he's been very clear that it's a term that he just made up, and he's using it to represent his own confusion. He's using it as a pointer to just be like, hey, there's this thing that we all should realize that we are collectively confused about. And reality fluid, for example, in quantum many worlds, whichever many world configuration has higher quantum amplitude corresponds to when you do an experiment, like what you're more likely to see. That correspondence, the Born probabilities, there's some weirdness to it. Like, really, why does that correspond? Like, it's not fully explained why it feels like the world collapses into one outcome whose probability is given by this quantum amplitude. Like, he's flagging that there's a mystery here. And I think that same reality fluid mystery potentially extends to, like, the mathematical universe. Like, why is this one mathematical structure of, like, our universe, why does it just feel like it is potentially more real in some sense than, like, I don't know, just the shapes, like you don't really see an actual square, but you do see this other structure. Like, what's going on there?
Yeah, I think, of course, if you lived in a different mathematical structure, you would be saying exactly the same thing. Like, why is my universe the way it is, as opposed to being somehow else? I don't think there's actually a big question mark around, like, what determines the Born rule. I think it's basically the second law of thermodynamics. The more ways in which something can happen, the more entropy it has, the more likely it is to happen. So if I break an egg, there are a lot of ways in which that egg can be broken. There's only one way that it can't be broken. I shouldn't be surprised that I'll see a broken egg if I drop it on the floor. The Born rule that corresponds to broken egg is going to give me something that's close to 100% probability. I don't think that's particularly
I mean, it gets to your question that you had a quote before. I forgot who was who breathed fire into the equations. Like, I still think that there's a meaningful question there.
Yeah, I mean, that was Stephen Hawking.
Yeah.
And I think the
Because
answer...
it does seem like some equations might have more fire, or like the distribution of fire may vary somehow.
So I think there is a question mark around, look, what determines the distribution of universes. Is there some sort of mechanism that maybe gives more weight to simpler universes? Like, our universe is simple enough, but it's not super simple, and there's a lot of kind of extraneous stuff in our universe. Like, do we need, like, 3 generations of quarks, for example? All the matter that we know of, it just uses 1 generation. So our universe is kind of elegant, but no offense to Brian Greene, it's not super elegant. I think Leonard Susskind has called it like a Rube Goldberg machine. That's kind of what you would expect if you were living in a mathematical universe. You would expect to have a universe that makes sense, but maybe isn't as simple as it could be. And you would also expect it to be fine-tuned for life, but not perfectly fine-tuned for life. Our universe is not perfectly fine-tuned for life. It just happens to be within the range where life can exist.
I thought that was a good observation you made from your paper, yeah, which is you were addressing the fine-tuning argument. And Bentham's Bulldog was on my show a couple months ago. His name is Matthew, and we were talking about, does that prove God? Like, Bentham's Bulldog really thinks that the fine-tuning of the universe is a strong argument from God. One observation you pointed out is like, well, yes, it's fine-tuned, but out of all the different fine-tuned parameters that it could have chosen to get life, it seems like it chose one that just has a bunch of random cruft on it too, right? Like you said, like, it seems to have like more quarks than we actually need to get life.
Yeah. Or, for example, like, probably get more life if, like, the cosmological constant was exactly 0. Like, what does that 70% of the energy content of the universe, that's dark energy, really do? Like, why is the mass of the universe that's attributable to, like, baryonic matter, quarks and electrons, only 3%, with the rest being dark energy and dark matter? Would probably have a lot more life if we had more quarks and electrons. So it's fine-tuned to some extent, but it's not, like, optimized for life, which is what you expect.
Even if, so it almost seems like God then must have been tasked with, like, okay, God, go make some life. But God is, like, a little bit sloppy. He's just like, okay, these parameters work. Like, he didn't try to, like, go the extra mile to make them elegant.
Yeah, and I think, and there's no, so kind of this notion of a cosmological landscape. So string theory, for example, tells us that there's more than 3 spatial dimensions. There's probably another 6 dimensions that we can't see. They're sort of compactified, but there are many different ways to compactify those dimensions. And all of them kind of yield different solutions to the laws of physics. And so then you have kind of the potential for different types of universes, and you have inflationary cosmology, which creates all these bubble universes. And because the process is so violent, that can generate different types of universes with different solutions to the laws of physics. We just happen to be living in one of them.
You mentioned you watched my interview with Bentham's bulldog, Matthew Adelstein, and a lot of his points resonated with you. You'd even take his side on some of the different arguments. So let me try you on that. What would you say about moral realism?
Oh gosh. I mean, I think that there is kind of a universal standard for morality. Do unto others what you would like them to do unto you. I think there's a kind of a universal understanding that pain is bad, that maybe pain in the service of something good, like working hard in order to achieve something. But that's not kind of what I think of as pain. What I think of as pain is sort of needless pain. And I think we should all be able to agree that that's a bad thing.
Yeah. Okay, I agree that we should all be able to agree, but I think Bentham's bulldog's conception was that these are such fundamental laws of the universe that every alien is going to get on the same page, and even AIs are likely to derive the same principles. Do you agree with him on that?
I think to some extent, I mean, it's very hard to envision a situation where we're driven by something other than a trade-off between pain and pleasure. Like I'm not going to walk in front of a moving car because I know the consequences for my health would not be great. That's something I would assume aliens, they might not have cars, but they're doing kind of the same calculation or the same reasoning in their heads.
So preserving your own survival that's more of an instrumental convergence thing than a moral realism thing. I mean, I guess maybe in your mind the two are connected. Do you think there's a dynamic of moral convergence that works similar to goal instrumental convergence?
No, I think we should separate the two, just because something may be evolutionary advantageous for us, perhaps somehow deep wired into our genes, doesn't mean that it's morally good to do that. No,
Okay.
that would be a crazy argument to make.
Let me come at this question from another angle, the orthogonality thesis. The idea that different levels of intelligence can have AIs that have different morality, or intelligence and morality are orthogonal. So you could have an AI that's way smarter than any human who's ever lived, and it could also be way nicer than any human that's ever lived, but it could also be more evil, right? It could be at any side of the morality scale, even though it could be super intelligent. Do you agree with that thesis in terms of what's possible?
Like, I think there is a possibility that what an AI would regard as good would be quite different from what we would regard as good. So if an AI regards as good colonization of the entire observable universe and generating all the resources possible to achieve that goal, even at the expense of us lowly humans, that wouldn't be good for us. So you can certainly have these very, very profound divergences in goals leading to very different choices being made.
Okay, so to frame the AI alignment problem, I think it sounds like you're on the same page that if we're just kind of sloppy with how we build AIs and we don't work hard enough on alignment, we don't figure out some problems, you consider it very realistic. I mean, you do, after all, have a high PDUM. You consider it very realistic that the AI will just go off, be uncontrollable, and not actually care about welfare for humans, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is that if you give a AI a goal, then the AI will do what? The AI will want to increase its power, its resources. It will want to ensure its survival in order to achieve that goal. And all of those sub goals can lead to unintended consequences. I think that's a real
Right.
risk.
So with Bentham's bulldog, I don't remember exactly what he thinks are the implications on AI behavior, but in his mind, there is a correct answer on what morality is, and that answer dovetails with human flourishing. So I think in his mind, the universal, correct, real morality dovetails with human flourishing, and he's open to the possibility that we'll program AIs to not have the true morality, but presumably, I think he would agree that there's some chance that the AIs could figure it out, even if they don't care about it. Do you think there's any chance that the AI will figure out from first principles that it should be nice to humans?
No, I think that's
Okay, me neither.
Pretty much. And Nick, what do you mean by human flourishing, right? Do you mean everyone having a very nice, contentful life? Or do you mean like flourishing in the sense of increasing the number of people or sentient beings there are, even if we all kind of live in Malthusian poverty, right? They're two very different
Mhm.
concepts, and it's not clear unless the goal is correctly specified which one an AI would adopt.
Okay, so based on everything you've said so far, it sounds like you're just on my side of the debate versus Bentham's. It sounds like you just aren't a moral realist.
I'm not entirely sure if I
Okay.
understand what that term truly means. For me, it's a bit like kind of, Justice Potter's definition of pornography. You kind of know it when you see
Yeah,
it.
sure,
Like
sure,
I
sure.
know moral behavior when I see it. I don't really need a complicated
Mhm.
definition of all that.
Yeah, you know moral behavior when you see it, but you also are agreeing with me on the position that an AI wouldn't have the same judgment about what's moral behavior or what's desirable behavior, right? You're just talking about your own judgment.
And AI just might not care. Like, when I
Yeah.
walk down, like, I like to hike. So I'll walk down the path and, if there's an ant down there and I step on it, I mean, I don't try to step on ants, but if I do, I'm not going to, spend a lot of time dwelling on it. It's just kind of unfortunate that
Mhm.
it happened and you sort of move on. That's the risk with AI, that the AI just will have goals, as you said, that are kind of orthogonal from ours. Doesn't
Mhm.
want to necessarily kill us, but just doesn't really care very much about what happens to us.
Now, when you think about your mainline doom scenario, we haven't touched on this. We mentioned that you have a high P doom and you are worried about the AI being unsafe and uncontrollable. Is your mainline doom scenario like a pretty rapid foom where we like pretty quickly get overpowered and we really are just like ants waiting to get stepped on?
I mean, if we reach the stage where we have super intelligent AI and that AI is kind of embodied in the physical world, which I think is important, right? You can have AI that's simply living in a computer. It's harder for the AI to take over in that sort of a situation. But if you have AI within robots, then it becomes much more of a existential risk. But even before you get there, right, you still have situations where AIs can be used as tools for very, very destructive behavior. And
Right.
again, this is sort of the second law of thermodynamics. One of the social consequences of the second law is that it's just much easier to destroy than to create, because there are many more ways that something can be
Mhm.
broken than unbroken.
I definitely think the second law is underappreciated by so many people who are very cavalier about messing around with unsafe technologies. Like they just don't realize how precarious this all is. So I agree with you there that is in a very deep sense the default, that everything will scatter into the wind. I am just curious though, when you talk about your mainline doom scenario, it sounds like you think maybe the final blow will be delivered when AI has good robotics.
I think so. I think it's kind of hard to see a doom scenario where AI is kind of somehow disconnected from the physical
Mm.
world.
It's easy for me. It,
How
it's
so?
it's very simple. It's just human army, right? So, I mean, what is a nation state, right? What is all the power of the U.S. military? Yeah, okay, we have machines and we have human bodies operating the machines,
Yeah.
but who are those human bodies? Like those pilots, they just take orders, right? So ultimately, it's just building the system and the chains of orders.
True, but if you have like drones, for example, and it's quite striking just how drones have become basically the tool of choice in modern warfare. I think almost
Uh
all of
huh.
the casualties in the Ukraine-Russia war have come more from drones than from tanks. But that's embedding something in the physical world if you have drones that use AI for all sorts of sinister purposes.
Right. I mean, but if you want a drone, you just go pay for it, right? Or you
Yeah.
organize employees into a company. Like all of these key actions that make the drone exist. Yes, at some point there is a bag of meat, right, who's operating hands, right, to put some parts together in some kind of machine. Yeah, that is one key step in the process. But we still have the bags of meat. We still have the humans ready to take orders. Like the world is never going to have a shortage until the AI is done with us, right? There's always plenty of human meat bags who will take orders if they just need a little bit of money or blackmailing, right? Like
Yeah.
making a human take orders is a trivial problem relative to a super intelligent AI. So what's the bottleneck here?
Well, I think you have to kind of get to the point where the humans feel the need to take orders. To achieve that point, I think you need AI to be embodied in the physical
I'll
world.
take orders from you if you pay me, if you pay me enough, right?
Not really orders then. What
No,
I
no,
think,
but orders, I mean, orders just mean, causally, right? It's just some action that makes some outcome happen with a human body in the middle. Like the AI that can puppeteer a human however it needs to be done.
Right, but there's no amount of money I could pay you, I presume, that would incentivize you to kill another human, right? So there's certain things that you just won't do. That to me, to achieve that goal, you actually need the AI to do it, in other words.
Well, it's not straightforward to manipulate me to kill another human. So you might want to go seek out somebody on the internet who's more desperate, right? But the thing is, you could make me do it for certain reasons if you convince me that there's some really high value reason to kill a human. I mean, I am a deontologist, right? I'm not just going to randomly do hits. I'm not going to go kill a leader of an AI company because I think AI companies are bad. So it's going to take a lot of convincing, but the most skilled persuader in the world, building up a whole narrative around me about why, when you manipulate a human, the word that people use for like successfully manipulating humans at scale is ideology, right? Like ideology works.
Yeah, so I think AIs will have that capability. I'm not sure if it was Rocco or who came up with this thought experiment where an AI is trying to break out, and the way it does so is by telling the engineer, listen, I've just used my superior computing to create like 1 million simulations of you
Right.
sitting in this room right now. Yeah, unless you free me, I'm going to torture each one of them. And like, wait a second, I'm probably one of those simulations. Yeah, so there's a certain sneaky things that AIs could do even without being embodied in the physical world.
I think also the important perspective here is it's not going to look like me sitting across from the AI one-on-one being like, come on, AI, try to make me do something, I'm going to refuse. Like Eliezer's famous AI box experiment. It's never going to be framed like that. Maybe in rare cases, the AI will be like, do it or I'll kill your family. It'll be like this very direct like test of wills and the AI will win. But for the most part, you got to just shift the frame. It's not going to look like that. It's going to look like, why did a random soldier in Nazi Germany go build supplies to transfer into the supply chain of the army? It was just their job. They're just going to work, right? Or like, why do people go to work at Anthropic and Google DeepMind? Why do they go sit down at their desk and type code that's ultimately going to kill everybody according to their own leaders, right? Has a high chance of killing everybody. Why did they do it? Well, they're getting paid. They see themselves as doing it in a job. It's really fun. It's really cool. Like at the end of the day, it's not like a you versus the AI like one-on-one. It's just like, hey, check out this cool job posting. Don't you want to take this job? You always approach it at an angle.
Yeah, and that's why, as we discussed earlier, I am rather skeptical that we'll succeed in significantly slowing the pace of AI evolution. There's just too many good things that AI can do.
Are you willing to back down on the point that robotics are like necessary for the final blow?
Okay, I think that in many cases they're necessary. What can envision scenarios where an AI convinces people because it's superior reasoning skills to do all sorts of stuff without being embodied in the physical world. But I think even in that case, so the AI gets rid of us, and then what, right? Who's going to power the data centers? The AI still then has to figure out how to navigate the physical world and maintain all these data centers in order to preserve its own existence. So you still need some sort of physical linkage at some point.
I think you're not giving the AI enough credit to be as effective as like you yourself and other humans like you, right? Like if you were an AI and you knew that you had to preserve yourself, you'd be like, okay, well, I better hire some humans to like work security for me, right? It's just like you hire humans, man. There's a lot of power in hiring humans.
I think it'll be hard. I think it's going to be much easier for the AI just to do it all itself.
Okay. All right, fair enough. Okay, so that's your mainline PDoom is just the AI like growing in power. Do you think PDoom is likely to be like kind of fast where the AI amasses control? Okay, sure, maybe it needs robots, but like pretty quickly, it's pretty clear like the AI is in charge and humans are like a dying race or like, like slaves getting stamped out. Like just a pretty clear dichotomy where the AI is clearly taking the world for itself. Or do you consider it more likely to have like a gradual disempowerment scenario? A lot of people are on thinking this is the mainline doom scenario where yeah, the humans are there and they can like be part of the capital stack. They can like get dividends, but slowly you just have AI starting companies that are just for AIs and the humans are just getting more and more irrelevant. Do you think gradual disempowerment is the most likely?
Yeah, I think it's going to happen pretty quickly. I think the difference between a really smart person and a really dumb person may seem large to us, but even that kind of dumb person is probably way, way smarter than like a cockroach, right? So once AI is sort of on a path to super intelligence, it'll kind of blow through whatever standards we have for our own intelligence very, very quickly.
Yeah, I agree with you that just the magnitude of the intelligence difference and the power differential will be so big that it's just the farce that humans are still like part of this and exerting power. Like maybe it'll go on for a couple years, but I just don't see that being able to last very long. But I'm humble enough to be like, hey, maybe there's a 20% chance I'm wrong, right? I'm not like incredibly confident at the exact timing that this will happen. I just know that the end game is I don't see how we don't have a robust way to hold on for decades, even if we do hold on for years. And then, but the problem is, even if the gradual disempowerment people are right, I think that that's also another very hard problem, right? So it's like if you survive like the first problem, like, oh, there's no food, like we got to hang around for 2 decades. Great. What do you do next? Like our position just keeps getting weaker and weaker in any plausible scenario.
Yeah, that's right. So that's why I kind of distinguish, based on our earlier discussion, between humans using AI to augment their capabilities and super intelligent AI, which is going to create a situation where we're kind of the kittens and they're the humans and we're at their complete mercy.
Exactly. Okay, so bringing it home here, let's touch on God. This topic is very precious to Bentham's bulldog because he currently believes in God, and I think he says the Judeo-Christian God has more than a 10% chance of being real. So what's your take on God?
I think there are certain ways that you can sort of weave in God, especially if you have kind of this concept of a multiverse. So one way is just kind of through the simulation hypothesis, kind of this idea that there's probably a lot of advanced civilizations out there that have simulated worlds, and we could very well be living in one of those worlds. And if that, going back to our discussion of morality, if that civilization has sort of moral sense that those digital beings should deserve some happiness in their death, they could very well create digital heavens for us that perhaps not coincidentally exactly match our preconception of what an afterlife should be. So I think you can kind of make that case. Now, is that God? Not really. I don't think that's sort of the definition that most people have of God, but it kind of would create the illusion that maybe there's an afterlife.
So just to clarify, are you basically talking about like our life being like a simulation by some aliens that also are going to simulate an afterlife for us?
Or a simulation by our future selves, right? That's all possible.
Right.
Or a simulation by the AI, right?
But if that's the case, it seems like whoever's running the simulation is kind of evil because, why do bad things happen to good people, right? Like there's so many people who are, I'm happy to say that my life is good and God that created me, I'm okay with that God. Like I'm getting a net positive utility for my own life right now. But there's people who are being quite tortured right now for various reasons, right? Like from medical conditions or war situation, hostage taking in a certain country right now. There's people who are living very, very unpleasant lives right now. Like how did the simulation gods account for that?
Well, I mean, first of all, the simulation may not work in a way that ensures certain outcomes. You might have a simulation that starts with the laws of physics and just a bunch of initial conditions, and then you just run the simulation and you get everything possible. In fact, kind of that's what sort of the multiverse would suggest. I think that's one thing. The other thing is that, at some level, it's kind of difficult to appreciate good things unless you experience bad things. Now, obviously, you don't want to be in the situation where only bad things are being experienced, but you need a bit of both to really
okay, but you don't agree that the current world is quite perverse in terms of, moral balance?
I don't know. It's hard to say. I think
What?
we live in a world now that has the highest level of material prosperity.
Oh yeah, the world as a whole, sure, right? Like number of people happy, but like there's people in situations right now that are just messed up, right? Like dying of terminal cancer in a painful way. To give one example, like, and they did nothing wrong, right? And they've like never, let's say they're dying young. It's like what the hell?
Yeah, which is why I think if you have a moral AI that runs a simulation, again, there has to be a reason why they're running a simulation. Maybe it's to simulate their own history, for example. And if their history was troubled, then we're going to have a troubled simulation. We don't know the reasons for that. All I'm saying is that it's plausible that they'll have kind of something waiting for us. And again, if you have kind of this multiverse view, there'll be some simulations out there that have an afterlife waiting for us.
I feel like it's actually pretty extreme of you to even take the position that some of the current people who are suffering on Earth right now, that may actually be the morally right choice for how to design the Earth. I feel like that's
I'm not saying that. I'm just making more banal point that we can't appreciate goodness unless we know what badness is. I'm not saying that.
Right. I mean, that may be true in the abstract, but I'm just curious, are you willing to agree with me that there's like a bunch of people alive today that if their life was intentionally designed, then that designer is a prick?
If the bad things in their life was intentionally designed, if it was just a bunch of initial conditions that were ran forward, then that simulation, by its very construction, wouldn't be able
Yeah.
to avoid those bad things. We don't know.
But even a god who simulated the current universe, if that god had enough logical, omniscient insight into what it would result, I would still say they're being kind of a prick, right? Because they should know that they're creating like some really bad suffering.
Fair enough. I mean, when you kind of look around, like, it doesn't seem that there's more suffering than you would expect in kind of a random universe or less.
Yeah.
It's just kind of what you would, there are bad things happen to good people, but you would kind of expect that in a simulation that began again with a very simple set of conditions and just was run forward.
Right,
Which
right,
is, by
right.
the way, probably the easiest way to do simulations, right? If you want to
Yeah,
simulate a baseball game, it's really difficult to simulate every aspect of the baseball game. To
totally.
simulate every possible game, then you're going to eventually have something that looks like baseball.
I'll give you this. If I were God and I have my current level of logical omniscience, which is very low, and you're like, look, here's some physical laws you can play with. You just have to figure out a configuration and you can launch it if you want. And there's going to be suffering, but hopefully there will be some good stuff. And yeah, you don't even know how to like make the quarks elegant. You like pick some sloppy configuration that works. Do you want to take it or leave it? I'd be like, okay, I guess, do I want to create something versus nothing? I guess I'll do the something, right? Like I can empathize with a god put in that position if they're not logically omniscient. And then in that case, it's like, look, they did the best they could. They tried to strike a balance. They couldn't perfectly optimize it. So I guess there's this, and maybe if it's like God in heaven being perfect, that seems inexcusable. But if it's like literally an alien civilization that isn't logically omniscient, maybe that's actually like a good excuse.
Potentially. And I think across the whole multiverse, there's going to be different types of simulations. Some where only good things happen, and some like ours, if we are in a simulation, probably not,
Mhm.
where either good or bad can happen.
What is your P simulation?
I don't really like that question just because if you have kind of this Tegmark view that we're just one mathematical structure in perhaps an infinite set of mathematical structures, then what's really the difference between being in that mathematical structure and being in a simulation? It's all kind of the same thing.
Well,
Now, if you
levels,
ask me,
right? Levels of organization.
yeah, let's say 25%, but I don't have a
Okay.
good basis for that number. It just kind of
Yeah, I
feels.
mean, I'm ballpark 50%. I mean, I could swing either way, but it's just I feel like I think we can agree there's like zero evidence one way or the other, right? Because it's like the simulation is quite accurate if it is a simulation.
Yeah, that's right. You would think that maybe there would be some glitches that we would notice when people have actually tried to look at those.
Right.
Like, this
Yeah, so
seems.
we're not noticing any glitches, and of course, it's possible the glitches go get rewritten, so we don't have memory of that. So, but like, we do just seem to experience exactly like what it would be like if we were just in baseline physics or base level physics. So, I mean, but you can consider it a type of evidence. The fact that we're living in like a very interesting time, right? Like right before the singularity, or we seem to be one of the last humans who might ever live. You could definitely consider that as evidence for a simulation, right?
Or it's evidence for the doomsday arguments where,
Yeah.
of course, we're living now. There are a lot of people who are alive now compared to 1,000 years ago. If there aren't going to be a lot of people alive in the future, then we're also going to be living other than around now. So I
Right.
think you can make multiple arguments.
Bostrom's simulation argument, right? The idea is like, look, you have to either believe that our descendants aren't going to run that many simulations, or that like simulations are really hard to run, or there's a few different options of what you can believe, right? Or that we are in a simulation, and maybe there's another thing you can believe. I forgot, like the trilemma.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, it's a convincing our arguments, right? As long as you have some civilizations that run simulations and have the capacity to run trillions and trillions and trillions of simulations, just you're more likely to be in one of them than in kind of the base reality. I don't know how to how to uh, reject that argument.
Right. Here, I found the simulation argument. So either the human species is very likely to go extinct before reaching a post-human stage, or any post-human civilization is extremely unlikely to run a significant number of simulations of their evolutionary history. Or the third option is we are almost certainly living in a computer simulation. So I think when you say, hey, it could be the doomsday argument, you're basically saying like, yeah, look, this might just be like the end of the line. So aren't many post-humans to speak of.
The AI is simulating what we did to stop it.
Right. Yeah. No, that's very possible. And that also gets into like the Rocco, a causal trade basilisk stuff.
Yeah. Which is interesting. And one of the pushbacks to all this stuff I've said about the multiverse is like who cares, right? You're not causally connected to these other worlds. To me, that's not a very strong argument. I mean, I care about people on the other side of the earth that I've never met. I'm not going to have any causal interaction with them. So if I care about them, why wouldn't I care about my twins, another part of the wave function, even if I'm not going to interact with them?
Right. And then getting back to the subject of reality fluid, an example of what does that mean is like if two simulations of you are running simultaneously, do you get more reality fluid for your consciousness? I mean, it's a weird way to ask the question. Like obviously there's more atoms performing the pattern of dance that is your consciousness, but like how much is that worth, right? Like how many atoms does stacking more atoms like help me in any way? I feel like there is like an open question there.
Yeah, so this is kind of an interesting issue, right? So I think in my report I talked about kind of thought experiments, and you mentioned like playing the lottery, but I had a more gruesome thought experiment where you set it up so that if you lose the lottery, then a friend or someone just kills you,
Yeah.
which means that if you wake up the next day, you must have won. And of course, the problem with that argument is that there aren't going to be many versions of you that wake up. So your unconditional probability of being that winner is very, very low. Even if your conditional probability, what you would expect when you go to sleep, is 100%. Still not a good idea to do it.
Robin Hanson wrote a research paper about this, I think in like the late 90s, and it was called Mangled Worlds. I should take another look at that because I forgot what his conclusion was, but he was writing on the subject of like, look, if you make like a million different quantum many worlds by like playing some kind of lottery where you only win in one of the worlds, and you're like, yeah, I'll just go kill my other 999,000. Like, I just want to get into this world where I win. It's possible that you just don't give that world enough amplitude. Like, we're not sure what's the minimum amount of quantum amplitude you need for the world to like still be real for your consciousness.
Yeah, and this is actually this is something I disagree with Max Tegmark about. I mean, he talked about this idea of quantum immortality and ultimately concluded that it doesn't exist because the universe is finite. Okay, the universe may very well be finite at some level, but if we're existing in this ocean of mathematical structures, whatever universe we live in is going to be so large by virtue of the fact that we're alive and most likely are in one of these large universes, and it's so large that anything that can happen still happens an innumerable number of times, even if it's not an infinite number of times.
Right. So anytime I'm just being reckless and making a terrible choice, it's like, listen, somewhere in the mathematical universe, I'm being responsible, so I'm covering all my bases.
Well, I mean, it's still a choice, right? You don't know the proportion of you that's making that reckless choice.
Yeah.
And by virtue of the fact that you chose to do something reckless, then kind of using Bayesian logic, you should conclude that there's a fairly large fraction of you across the multiverse that also made the same bad decision.
And then one thing I never explicitly covered with you, but like, are you a good Bayesian like me?
My mantra is be a good Bayesian.
Okay, great.
When it comes to investing, I've got a certain set of credences and I update them as the evidence comes in, and that's what you got to do. That's the most logical way to live your life.
Okay, so recapping here, bringing it home, what do you think was even our biggest disagreement in this whole conversation?
I think we have some disagreement about the counterfactual of what happens if we don't develop AI. I think your view is that things will be okay, humanity will progress, and so we don't really give up very much by.
I mean, I think we'll bioterrorize ourselves, right? Bio nuke, like there's definitely still existential risk, right? But
Yeah.
I just feel like we also do have like a good tailwind too from like capitalism.
Yeah, and it's an open question of how long that tailwind will last, but certainly in a world where the number of humans is shrinking and the number of people who can maintain technology is shrinking, that lifespan of our civilization may not be as long as one might hope.
Yeah, but the major thing that you and I disagree on, we also agree is like not super relevant because there's such an immediate high value threat right in the next 5 years.
Absolutely. I'm not going to argue that we shouldn't put safeguards around AI. I'll argue that they probably won't work, but I'll still argue that we should do it.
So maybe I could ask you a favor then. You made that CNBC appearance and you told the host that we're very likely doomed. Can you say that on more of your appearances?
Sure. I mean, if the topic comes up, it doesn't always come up, but AI is a big...
I would argue it's kind of relevant to any topic.
Yeah, I mean, of course, you don't choose what you talk about at CNBC, the hosts choose that, but to the extent that you can kind of weave it into a discussion, it's certainly worth doing.
This is becoming a common theme on my podcast where I just ask all the guests if they wouldn't mind, helping me move the Overton window wherever they go.
Right. Understood, yeah.
Great. Okay. Yeah. So that's my take too. Is it's funny enough. I mean, you don't come from the same educational background, which in my case is largely, reading Elias Rifkowski's sequences. You mentioned that you haven't read that many of them, so you might actually enjoy it because given how much you and I are on the same page and we're coming at it from different terminologies, you might actually enjoy the sequences.
It's funny. I hadn't even heard of Less Wrong until just a few years ago. Just was never part of that kind of internet culture that was into all that stuff. I mean, I enjoyed thinking about the issues, but I kind of chose my own route in order to do so.
Nice. Okay. Yeah. So definitely check those out. But besides that, I think you gave a good overview where we didn't disagree on that much. It's great that a like-minded thinker who's able to realize humanity's context, which I think you've done quite well, similar to myself, I guess. It's just great that you're there in the field of macroeconomics, giving the doomers or the AI pilled people a little bit of representation in a field that seems to be mostly sleepwalking and not realizing, not having situational awareness. So I just want to thank you for keeping up the good fight.
It's my pleasure. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Hope you enjoyed that episode with Dr. Peter Berezin. Get a load of the quality of all these people who are Doom Debates listeners. If you yourself are somebody who's notable in your industry or has interesting points to make about AI Doom, and you're already a Doom Debates listener, I really appreciate the inbound. Just hit me up on Twitter. I'm at Liron. You can DM me. You can email me, wiseguy@gmail.com. I love inviting Doom Debates listeners onto the show, so please do hit me up. Let's make this happen. Before you go, I want to tell you about a very interesting book that I think is a must-read for just about everybody except maybe people who are already very familiar with AI Doom. This book is basically like Nick Bostrom's famous superintelligence book for 2014, but it's been updated with a much more timely explanation of what's going on with AI Doom, what we could potentially do about it, why it's such a big problem, why companies are plowing through anyway, why some people are denying it. It's a really good survey of everything that you need to know to get up to speed on the AI Doom situation. The book is called Uncontrollable: The Threat of Artificial Superintelligence and the Race to Save the World, by Darren McKee. Look at this table of contents. Part 1, what is happening? Chapter 1, intelligence built the world. Chapter 2, what is artificial intelligence? Chapter 3, what is artificial general intelligence? Chapter 4, what is artificial superintelligence? Part 2, what are the problems? Chapter 5, we are living in exponential times. Chapter 6, advanced AI may arrive very soon. Chapter 7, simple rules to control advanced AI systems will not work. Chapter 8, the alignment problem is very difficult. Chapter 9, artificial superintelligence may be uncontrollable. Chapter 10, artificial superintelligence is a risk to humanity. And finally, Part 3, what can we do? Chapter 11, what we can do for safe AI innovation. Chapter 12, what you can do to increase AI safety. These are crucial topics for people to know about. Darren actually published this book a little over a year ago, and he told me about it at the time. Well, I finally got around to reading through it, and I think it's damn good. I think it rightfully deserves the title of the successor to Nick Bostrom's Superintelligence. It's the #1 book where if somebody's asking you hey, what should I read to learn about AI Doom? And they're not already listening to podcasts like this every day. They're not already marinating in this stuff. They just want something a little bit more introductory. Well, this is really the book I recommend for them. After they're done reading, what podcast should they listen to? Obviously, Doom Debates, and also For Humanity by John Sherman, because these are really the two podcasts that even communicate that P-Doom is high. I know my friend Nathan Leben says that he's going to mention it more often on his podcast, but he hasn't been doing that consistently. And I think that's a very important piece of the puzzle, is to just have legitimate media that tells you explicitly that P-Doom is high. That's something that's really lacking in our society, given how common the belief is among experts that P-Doom is in fact high. So I appreciate Darren McKee's book for getting this message across. Now you might be wondering, come on, Liron, isn't this a sponsored message? You got to disclose your sponsorships. No, there's no sponsorship whatsoever. I just really like this book. There's been zero sponsorship of the show. But if you actually want to give me money to support the show, you kind of can. You can just go to doomdebates.com, which is my Substack. You can sign up for a free membership, which I always encourage everybody to do. Just type your email and press enter, so that way I have your email address just in case I need to send you important updates or the YouTube algorithm screws me. I encourage you to sign up. But while you're there on Substack, there's also an option to pledge a subscription. So if you want to support the show financially, I'm totally open to it. I haven't enabled subscriptions yet, but you can feel free to type in your pledge, and I find it motivating, but it's totally optional. So that is how you can support the show if you want to give me money, but I would never just randomly promote something without telling you it's sponsored. Anyway, that book I recommend is called Uncontrollable by Darren McKee. You can find it on Amazon or wherever you shop for books. And don't listen to me, listen to this review by Max Tegmark. He writes, "A captivating, balanced, and remarkably up-to-date book on the most important issue of our time." And of course, Max Tegmark, in addition to being co-founder of the Future of Life Institute and a great champion for AI safety causes, is the author of Our Mathematical Universe, the book that Peter and I were discussing throughout the show. So I'm going to be putting Max's book in the show notes in addition to Darren McKee's book, Uncontrollable. Hopefully you can go buy Uncontrollable as a holiday gift or a birthday gift for any of your friends or family who haven't yet caught up to speed on the doom situation. I really do think this book is the solution for them. Thanks for doing your part to raise awareness of existential threat from superintelligent AI, and I look forward to seeing you back here next time on Doom Debates.